The grandfather clock stood in the corner of the storage unit like a sentinel guarding nothing. 8 feet tall, dark mahogany darkened further by a century of candle smoke and kitchen grease and the invisible residue of lives lived too close to the bone. Its face was cracked down the middle. The Roman numerals faded to ghosts of themselves. The brass pendulum frozen at an angle that suggested the mechanism had seized decades ago. The whole thing leaned slightly to the left, as if exhausted by the weight of keeping time for people who had run out of it. Claire Donovan pressed her back against the corrugated metal wall of the unit and stared at it. Unit 14B, Riverside Self-Storage, Louisville, Kentucky. 10 feet by 10 feet of concrete floor and fluorescent hum. This was what remained of her inheritance. Not the house, not the land, not the savings account or the furniture or the photo albums or the china set that had been in the family since before the Civil War. Just the clock. Her brothers had taken everything else. Nora shifted beside her, 7 years old, small for her age, made smaller by the second-hand coat that hung past her wrists. She held a stuffed bear named Captain with one button eye and stuffing leaking from a seam in his left ear. The bear had survived 3 shelters, 2 motels, and 4 months of sleeping in a Corolla that smelled like old French fries and exhaustion. "Mama, is that our clock?" Claire's throat tightened. "Yeah, baby, that's our clock." Nora tilted her head, studying it with the seriousness children reserve for things they sense matter more than they understand. "It's really big." "It is. Does it still work?" Claire looked at the frozen pendulum, the cracked face, the cabinet door hanging open on one rusted hinge. The base was enormous, a solid block of carved mahogany nearly 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, sitting heavy on the concrete like it had no intention of ever being moved again. "I don't think so. Captain says it's just sleeping. Things that are old sleep a lot, but they wake up when someone loves them again." Claire almost smiled. Almost. But the weight of everything pressed too hard against her chest, and what came out instead was a sound caught between laughter and grief. She covered her mouth with her hand and turned away so Nora wouldn't see. The storage unit cost $89 a month. Claire had $214 left. After gas, after the last payment on the motel room they'd been asked to leave 3 days ago, after peanut butter and bread and the off-brand apple juice Nora liked, $214 was what stood between them and sleeping in the car again. She couldn't afford the clock, couldn't afford to keep it, couldn't afford to move it, couldn't afford the space it occupied in a life that had no space left for anything that didn't directly contribute to survival. But she couldn't let it go, because the clock was the last thing her grandmother had touched, the last object in the world that still carried Edith Donovan's fingerprints, her intentions, her voice. And Claire had promised. The memory came unbidden, sharp as a blade drawn across skin. Edith's bedroom in the farmhouse outside Lexington. The old woman propped against pillows, her body failing but her eyes still fierce, still lit with the particular fire of someone who had spent 91 years refusing to be diminished by circumstance. "Claire, come here." "I'm here, Graham." Edith's hand, thin as paper, gripping Claire's wrist with surprising strength. "The clock. Whatever happens with the house, with the boys, with any of it, you keep the clock." The boys meant her brothers. Patrick and Daniel, Graham's grandsons, Claire's older brothers by 4 and 6 years respectively, both of whom had been circling the inheritance like crows over roadkill since Edith's first stroke. "Why the clock, Graham?" Edith's eyes had sharpened, cutting through the morphine haze. "Because it's the only thing worth keeping. The house is just wood and nails. The land is just dirt. But that clock," she paused, breath rattling. "That clock knows things." Claire had thought it was the medication talking, the rambling of a dying woman whose mind was loosening its grip on the present. She'd squeezed Edith's hand and promised, because that's what you do when someone you love is dying. You promise whatever they ask because the alternative is watching them leave with fear in their eyes. The clock knows things. Now, standing in a storage unit in Louisville, Claire wondered what exactly her grandmother had meant. Nora had wandered to the clock and was pressing her face against the glass door of the cabinet, peering at the frozen pendulum. Captain, held against the glass, appeared to be doing the same. "Mama, there are scratches inside. Like someone drew pictures." Claire stepped closer. Through the grime on the glass, she could see marks on the interior walls of the cabinet. She opened the door carefully, the hinge protesting with a sound like a small animal in distress. Inside, the walls of the clock's cabinet were covered in faint scratches. Not random, deliberate. Numbers and letters carved into the wood with something sharp. A pin or a knife tip. So small they were nearly invisible unless you pressed your face close enough to smell the old mahogany. Claire's skin prickled. She leaned in closer, trying to make out the markings, but the light was wrong. The fluorescent tubes overhead cast shadows that filled the shallow carvings, making them harder to read rather than easier. What does it say? I can't tell yet. Captain wants to know if it's a treasure map. Claire looked at her daughter, at the bear with one eye, at the enormous clock looming above them both. A treasure map. The kind of thing a 7-year-old would imagine. The kind of thing that only happened in stories. We'll figure it out later. Right now we need to find a place to sleep tonight. She locked the storage unit, checked the padlock twice, and led Nora back to the Corolla parked outside. The car had 187,000 miles on it, and a transmission that made sounds no transmission should make. The back seat held everything they owned. 2 duffel bags, a garbage bag of clothes, a box of food, a plastic bin of Nora's school papers and drawings. A life compressed into the cargo space of a mid-sized sedan. They had been homeless for 5 months. The word still felt wrong in Claire's mouth, like speaking a language she hadn't learned. Homeless. She had a degree in accounting from the University of Kentucky. She had worked at a firm in Lexington for 6 years before Nora's father left, before the firm downsized, before the apartment lease expired and the landlord sold the building, before the dominoes started falling in a sequence so predictable she could see each one tipping before it hit the next, but couldn't move fast enough to stop any of them. Patrick had offered to let her stay with him for a week. 1 week. His wife, Karen, had made that clear with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the conversation in front of a mirror. We want to help, Claire, but we have our own family to think about. The guest room is available until Saturday. Daniel hadn't offered anything. He'd sent a text. Sorry to hear about your situation. Let me know if you need anything. The universal language of people who had no intention of actually helping. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Both brothers had inherited the farmhouse. Both had inherited the land. Both had inherited Edith's savings, modest but real, and the furniture and the dishes and the memories packed into closets and drawers and the spaces between floorboards. And when Claire had asked for her share, for anything, for acknowledgement that she existed as a member of this family, Patrick had smiled his practiced smile and said the will was clear. The will was clear. Edith had died without updating the document she'd written in 1987, when Claire was 3 years old and her mother was still alive and the world was arranged differently. The will left the house and land to the boys. Equal shares. Claire received what the document called personal effects of sentimental value, which the executor interpreted as the grandfather clock and a box of old photographs. Patrick and Daniel had divided everything else. The house was worth $340,000. The land, 40 acres of bluegrass country, was worth considerably more. The savings account held $67,000. The antique furniture, the silver, the collection of first edition books Edith had accumulated over 9 decades. All of it parceled out between 2 brothers who had visited their grandmother twice a year at Christmas and on her birthday, who had tolerated her stories about the old days with the glazed patience of men waiting for the check. Claire had been there every week, had driven the 45 minutes from Lexington every Sunday for 6 years, had sat at Edith's kitchen table while the old woman brewed coffee strong enough to strip paint and told stories about the Donovan family that stretched back to Ireland and forward into warnings about the future. That clock came over on the ship with your great-great-grandfather. 1847. He carried it on his back from the docks in New York to a wagon heading west. 8 feet tall and heavy as sin, and he wouldn't leave it behind. People thought he was crazy, but Seamus Donovan knew what he was carrying. What was he carrying, Graham? Edith had smiled, the kind of smile that held secrets behind its teeth. The only thing worth more than land, Claire. The only thing that lasts longer than money. Claire had assumed she meant love, or family, or some abstract concept that grandmothers wrapped in metaphor because they'd earned the right to be cryptic. Now she wasn't sure. The shelter on 4th Street had space. Claire knew because she'd called ahead, navigating the automated phone system with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned which shelters answered fastest, which ones had beds for children, which ones didn't ask too many questions. They arrived at 6. The intake worker was a woman in her 50s named Donna, who processed them with kind eyes and the mechanical rhythm of someone who had done this too many times. How long have you been without permanent housing? 5 months. Any substance abuse issues, mental health diagnoses, history of domestic violence? No, no, no. Donna looked at Nora, then back at Claire. The look said everything. Another mother, another child, another story that started with stability and ended here. Dinner's at 7. Lights out at 10. You can stay for up to 14 days. After that, we'll need to talk about next steps. Next steps. As if homelessness were a staircase, you climbed one rung at a time until you reached the top and found a door marked normal life. As if the steps weren't greased and the railings weren't broken and the door at the top wasn't locked from the other side. Their beds were in a room with 6 other women and their children. Nora clutched Captain and stared at the ceiling. Mama, when we get our own house, can the clock live in the living room? Claire pulled the thin blanket up to her daughter's chin. If we get a living room, the clock gets the best spot. By the window, so it can see outside. By the window. Nora closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed. Sleep came easier for children, even children who had learned too early that the world wasn't reliable. Something about youth or resilience or the simple mechanics of a body that hadn't yet learned to stay alert through the night. Claire lay awake and thought about the scratches inside the clock, about Edith's grip on her wrist, about the words that sounded like medication and grief but might have been something else entirely. The clock knows things. She made a decision in the darkness, between the sounds of strangers breathing and the distant rumble of traffic on the interstate. She would go back to the storage unit. She would read those scratches. She would follow whatever trail her grandmother had left, not because she believed in treasure maps or hidden fortunes or any of the stories that sounded good in movies, but because Edith Donovan had never said anything she didn't mean, and because Claire had run out of other options. Morning came gray and cold. December in Louisville wore its weather like a punishment, the sky pressing down, the wind finding every gap in every coat. Claire left Nora at the shelter's children's program and drove to the storage unit with a flashlight she'd borrowed from the front desk and a notebook she'd taken from the free pile at the public library. The clock stood exactly as she'd left it, leaning, frozen, enormous. She opened the cabinet door and knelt on the concrete floor, pressing her face close enough to the interior walls that she could smell the mahogany, feel the grain against her cheek. The scratches were organized. That was the first thing she noticed. Not random vandalism or idle marks. They were arranged in columns, like ledger entries. Numbers on the left, letters on the right, connected by thin lines carved with patient precision. Claire aimed the flashlight at an angle that threw shadows into the scratches, making them stand out against the wood. The first column read 47. 3, 12. The letters beside it spelled out NW corner base. The second line read 91. 7, 22. Beside it, hinge left panel. The third read 63. 1 18. SE face lower. There were 12 entries total, each with a number sequence and a notation that seemed to reference parts of the clock itself. Claire sat back on her heels, heart beating faster. She opened the notebook and copied every line exactly, checking twice, 3 times, making sure she hadn't misread a digit or transposed a letter. Then she looked at the clock again. Really looked at it. Not as a relic, not as a sentimental object, not as the last connection to a dead woman. She looked at it as a structure, as a container. The base was massive, disproportionately so. The clock's face and cabinet occupied perhaps 5 feet of its total height. The base accounted for nearly 3 feet, a solid block of carved mahogany that sat like a foundation for the timepiece above. The carvings were ornate, geometric patterns interlocking in ways that suggested craftsmanship beyond simple decoration. Flowers that weren't quite flowers. Vines that twisted in patterns too regular to be natural. Claire crawled around to the back of the clock. The rear panel of the base was plain, undecorated, made of the same dark wood but without the ornamental carving. She pressed her fingers along its edges, feeling for seams or joints that might indicate a separate piece. There, near the bottom left corner, a gap so narrow it was invisible unless you ran your fingertip directly over it. A seam between 2 pieces of wood that had been fitted together with such precision that they appeared to be one. She tried to pry it open with her fingernails. Nothing moved. She tried pressing various points along the seam. No give. She pushed, pulled, twisted. The panel remained fixed. Claire returned to her notes. NW corner base. The first notation. She moved to the northwest corner of the clock, the front left when facing it. The carved mahogany showed an intricate pattern of interlocking circles. She pressed each one in turn, feeling for movement. The third circle from the top shifted slightly under her thumb. Not much, maybe a quarter of an inch inward. A mechanism clicked somewhere inside the wood, a sound so faint she might have imagined it. She moved to the next notation. Hinge left panel. The left side of the base. She ran her hands along the carved surface, fingers tracing vines and leaves. One section of vine was slightly raised compared to its neighbors. She pressed it. Another click, louder this time. Her hands were shaking. She moved faster now, working through the notations. SE face lower. A carved flower on the southeast corner that depressed with pressure. Upper molding center. A decorative ridge along the top of the base that slid sideways when pushed. Each activation produced a click, each click more definitive than the last. When she pressed the 12th and final mechanism, the rear panel of the base released with a sound like a lock turning in a door that hadn't been opened in decades. Claire scrambled to the back of the clock. The panel had shifted outward by perhaps 2 inches, enough to grip with her fingers. She pulled. The wood swung open on hinges so perfectly fitted they moved without sound despite what must have been a century or more since their last use. Behind the panel was darkness. Claire aimed the flashlight inside. A compartment occupied the interior of the base. The space was larger than she'd expected, the walls of the clock's base thicker than the exterior suggested, hollowed out to create a hidden chamber roughly 2 feet deep, 2 feet wide, and 18 inches high. The interior was lined with tin, aged to a dull gray but intact, protecting whatever was inside from moisture and insects and the slow deterioration of time. On the tin floor of the compartment sat 3 objects. A leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and darkened with age but still holding together. A velvet pouch, drawstrung with a cord that had gone stiff and brittle. And an envelope, cream-colored, sealed with red wax that bore the imprint of a ship. Claire reached in with hands that wouldn't stop trembling and removed all 3 items. She set them on the concrete floor of the storage unit, arranged in a row, and stared. Then she opened the envelope first. Because envelopes contained explanations, and she desperately needed one. The letter inside was written in Edith's handwriting. Claire recognized it immediately, the slightly tilted cursive, the way the T's were crossed with aggressive horizontal strokes, the loops on the Y's and G's that dipped below the line like anchors. My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you've kept the clock as I asked. I'm sorry I couldn't explain while I was alive. The boys would have torn this apart looking for what I'm about to tell you. And what's inside this clock isn't meant for tearing apart. It's meant for someone who understands that some things are worth more than money. But ironically, what I've hidden here is also worth a great deal of money. Claire's vision blurred. She blinked hard and kept reading. Your great-great-grandfather Seamus didn't bring this clock from Ireland because he was sentimental. He brought it because the base contained everything the family had saved for 3 generations. When the famine hit, the Donovans converted their entire holdings into something small enough to carry and valuable enough to start over with. They hid it in the clock because no one looks twice at furniture. People search pockets and luggage and the linings of coats. They don't search grandfather clocks. What Seamus carried into this country has been added to by every generation since. Your great-grandfather Thomas added to it during Prohibition. Your grandfather William added to it during the war. And I've added to it over the past 70 years. I didn't tell the boys because Patrick would sell it for a boat and Daniel would gamble it away inside a year. You know this is true. I didn't tell your mother because she married a man who couldn't keep a secret if you sewed his lips shut. I'm telling you because you're the one who sat with me every Sunday. You're the one who listened. You're the one who understood that some things are worth protecting even when protecting them costs you everything. Open the journal. Study it. Understand what you have before you show it to anyone. Then find someone you trust to help you navigate what comes next. The velvet pouch contains a sample. Just enough to verify what I'm telling you is real. The rest is in the walls of the clock itself. Every panel, every carved section, every decorative element. It's all hidden compartments. The clock is the vault, Claire. It always has been. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't do more while I was alive. But this is my doing more. This is everything. You're Graham, Edith. Claire sat on the cold concrete floor and sobbed. Not quietly, not gracefully. She cried with her whole body, shoulders heaving, hands pressed against her face, the letter crumpled against her cheek. She cried for Edith, for Nora, for herself, for 5 months of sleeping in a car and begging for shelter beds, and watching her daughter learn that the world was unreliable. She cried until there was nothing left. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve and opened the velvet pouch. 3 stones fell into her palm. Clear, brilliant, catching the fluorescent light and throwing it back in fractured rainbows that painted the concrete walls with color. Even Claire's untrained eye could see they were extraordinary, each roughly the size of her thumbnail, cut with precision, flawless to the naked eye. Diamonds. She opened the journal with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. The first page was dated 1847, written in a hand she didn't recognize. Seamus Donovan's, she assumed. The ink had faded to brown. The paper was brittle at the edges, but the words were still legible. Arrived New York Harbor, March 17th. Passage took 47 days. Lost 23 souls to fever. The cargo survived. 212 stones, various sizes, quality assessed by Dublin gemologist before departure. All grade 1 or 2. Additional gold coins, 47 pieces, various origin. Silver plate, 14 items. 3 rings, 2 necklaces, 1 brooch. Total assessed value at embarkation, £4,700 sterling. Claire's breath stopped. She did the math instinctively, the accountant's brain calculating before the rest of her could process the implications. £4,700 sterling in 1847, adjusted for inflation, converted to modern currency. The number was staggering, but that was just the starting point. The journal entry said every generation had added to it. She turned pages carefully, reading entries that spanned decades. Thomas Donovan in 1923, documenting the addition of what he called investment pieces acquired during the economic uncertainty. William Donovan in 1944, noting the inclusion of items recovered during his service in Europe, carefully described without using words that might implicate anyone in anything. The entries were meticulous, each generation maintaining the ledger with the same precision, recording additions, occasionally noting removals for family emergencies, always tracking the total. Edith's entries began in 1955. Her handwriting was younger but recognizable, the same tilted cursive, the same aggressive T's. She documented 70 years of careful accumulation. Gem purchases made through discreet dealers. Gold acquired in small quantities over decades. Rare coins added 1 or 2 at a time, always paid in cash, always transported personally, always added to the clock's hidden compartments with notes about which panel held what. The final entry was dated 3 months before Edith's death. Total assessed value based on current market rates and conservative gem grading. The number was written in Edith's shaking hand, the digits uneven but legible. $287 million. Claire read it 3 times. Then she closed the journal, placed it carefully on the floor, and pressed her forehead against the cold concrete. $287 million. Hidden inside a grandfather clock in a storage unit that cost $89 a month. She was homeless. Her daughter slept on shelter cots. She had $214 to her name. And she was sitting next to a clock that contained a fortune accumulated across 5 generations and 177 years of patient, secretive, deliberate protection. The absurdity of it made her laugh. The laugh turned into something else, something between hysterics and awe, a sound that bounced off the metal walls of the storage unit and came back to her ears sounding like someone she didn't recognize. She stayed on the floor for a long time. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her with the indifference of machines that didn't care about human revelations or reversals of fortune. The clock stood silent in the corner, keeping its secrets the way it had for nearly 2 centuries. Finally, Claire sat up. She replaced the journal, the pouch, and the letter in the hidden compartment. She closed the panel, hearing the mechanisms re-engage with soft clicks that sounded like whispered promises. She locked the storage unit, walked to her car, sat behind the wheel, and stared at the steering wheel for 11 minutes without moving. Then she drove back to the shelter. That night, after dinner, after lights out, after Nora had fallen asleep with Captain tucked under her chin, Claire lay in the dark and planned. She couldn't tell anyone. Not yet. Edith's warning about the brothers was specific and accurate. Patrick would hire lawyers within the hour, claiming the clock's contents were part of the estate that should have been divided equally. Daniel would do worse. He'd talk. He'd tell everyone. And once word got out, the vultures would circle. She needed verification. The 3 diamonds could be glass for all she knew. The journal could be a fantasy, an old woman's delusion documented with the conviction of someone who'd lost touch with reality. The numbers could be meaningless. But Claire's accounting brain had studied the entries. The acquisitions were detailed, dated, sourced. The gemological assessments referenced specific dealers and grading systems she could verify. The gold purchases aligned with historical price data she remembered from economic history courses. Everything in the journal had the structure and specificity of legitimate financial records. Edith Donovan had been many things, but she had never been delusional. Claire needed help. The kind she couldn't afford and didn't know how to find. A gemologist who could assess the diamonds without reporting them. A lawyer who could protect her interests without charging fees she couldn't pay. Someone who understood what it meant to hold something valuable while being too vulnerable to protect it alone. She fell asleep without answers. The shelter breathed around her, dozens of lungs filling and emptying in the dark, the collective respiration of people who had fallen through the cracks and landed in a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and microwave dinners. Morning came with oatmeal and orange juice and the specific energy of a shelter waking up. Children bouncing between cots. Mothers organizing bags and checking phones for messages about job applications and housing waitlists. The quiet choreography of survival performed by people who had become experts at it. Claire dropped Nora at the children's program and drove to the public library. She needed information, and libraries were the last free resource in a world that charged for everything else. The librarian was a man in his 60s named Harold who wore bow ties and spoke in the careful cadence of someone who respected silence. He directed Claire to the reference section without asking questions. A kindness she filed away alongside the shelter worker who didn't judge and the gas station attendant who pretended not to notice when she filled her water bottles from the bathroom sink. She researched for 4 hours. Diamond authentication, estate law in Kentucky, antique valuation, hidden asset reporting, tax implications of inherited property. Each search opened new corridors of complexity, and each corridor branched into more questions than answers. But one name kept appearing in her research on gemological assessment. Margaret Wu, certified gemologist, Louisville. Independent practice, specializing in estate appraisals and antique jewelry authentication. Her reviews described her as discreet, thorough, and willing to work with clients in unusual circumstances. Claire called from the library's courtesy phone. Dr. Wu's office. How can I help? You? I need an appraisal. 3 loose diamonds. I can't tell you where they came from, and I need absolute confidentiality. The pause on the other end was brief, but weighted. Can you come in Thursday at 2? I can't afford your fee. Another pause, longer this time. Come in Thursday. We'll discuss the fee after I've seen the stones. Thursday felt like a year away. Claire spent the intervening days at the shelter, helping in the kitchen because it kept her hands busy and her mind from spinning into scenarios she couldn't control. She played with Nora in the common room, read stories, drew pictures, pretended everything was fine with the practiced ease of a mother whose primary skill had become performance. At night, she lay awake and thought about the clock. About $287 million sitting in a storage unit protected by a padlock she'd bought at a hardware store for $12. About Seamus Donovan carrying that clock on his back through streets that smelled like fish and sewage, and the particular desperation of people starting over in a country that hadn't asked for them. About Edith, alone in the farmhouse for the last years of her life, sitting next to a clock worth more than the entire county, making coffee and watching birds and carrying a secret that must have felt like swallowing stones. About Patrick and Daniel, who had taken the house and the land and the money and left their sister with a broken clock and a box of photographs, confident they had gotten the better deal. Thursday arrived. Claire left Nora at the shelter and drove to Margaret Wu's office, a second-floor suite above a dry cleaner in a strip mall that had seen better decades. The waiting room held 2 chairs and a ficus tree that was either fake or dying. Claire couldn't tell which. Margaret Wu appeared from the back office, a compact woman in her 50s with close-cropped silver hair and glasses that magnified her eyes to twice their natural size. She wore a lab coat over a navy dress and moved with the efficient precision of someone who wasted nothing, not time, not words, not energy. Miss Donovan. Claire. Claire, then. Come in. The office was small but immaculate. A workbench dominated one wall, covered in equipment Claire couldn't name. Microscopes, lights, scales, instruments that looked like they belonged in a hospital. Margaret gestured to a chair beside the bench. Show me what you have. Claire pulled the velvet pouch from her coat pocket and placed it on the bench. The 3 stones tumbled out onto the white surface, catching the specialized lighting and exploding into brilliance. Margaret didn't gasp. She didn't exclaim or widen her eyes or do any of the things people did in movies when confronted with precious stones. Instead, she went very still, the kind of still that suggested everything happening was internal, invisible, contained. She picked up the first stone with tweezers, placed it under a loupe, and studied it in silence for 3 full minutes. Then the second stone, then the third. Each received the same careful, unhurried examination. When she finally looked up, her expression was neutral in a way that clearly required effort. Where did you get these? I can't say. Not yet. Margaret removed her glasses and cleaned them with a cloth. A gesture Claire recognized as stalling while thoughts were organized. These are natural diamonds. Unenhanced, untreated. The largest is approximately 4.2 carats, D-color, internally flawless. The other 2 are slightly smaller but comparable quality. What are they worth? Margaret replaced her glasses. Individually, at auction, the large stone would fetch between 300,000 and 400,000. The smaller ones, 150,000 to 200,000 each. She paused. These are not ordinary stones, Claire. Diamonds of this quality and size without any modern treatment or enhancement are extraordinarily rare. The cut is old European, consistent with 19th century techniques. Claire's hands were clasped so tight in her lap her knuckles had gone white. What if I told you there were more? Margaret's expression didn't change. How many more? Claire swallowed. A lot more. The silence in the office was absolute. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere below them, a dry cleaning machine thumped through its cycle. Margaret set down the tweezers carefully. I think you'd better tell me the whole story. Claire told her. Not everything. Not the specific numbers from the journal, but enough. The clock. The hidden compartments. The family legacy stretching back to 1847. Edith's letter. The inheritance that wasn't an inheritance, or rather, the inheritance that was everything while appearing to be nothing. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Claire finished, the gemologist was quiet for a long time. You're homeless. Yes. And you're sitting on what sounds like one of the largest private gem collections in the country. Maybe. I don't know for sure. The journal says 287 million, but I can't verify that without opening every compartment, and I don't want to do that alone. Margaret stood and walked to the window. She looked out at the parking lot below, at the strip mall anchored by a dollar store and a nail salon, at the world that continued in its ordinary way while something extraordinary sat on her workbench. I'll waive my fee. Claire started to protest, but Margaret raised a hand. I'm not doing this for charity. I'm doing this because if what you're describing is real, it's the most significant gemological discovery of my career. I want to be part of it. But more than that, I want to make sure you're protected. She turned back to Claire. You need a lawyer. Someone who specializes in estate law and asset protection. Someone who can keep their mouth shut. I can't afford a lawyer. Margaret picked up her phone. You can't afford not to have one. I know someone. Give me a day. Claire left the office carrying the 3 diamonds in her coat pocket, their weight against her thigh a constant reminder that the world had shifted and nothing would be the same. That evening, at the shelter, Nora drew a picture of the clock. She'd added details from memory. The cracked face, the frozen pendulum, the carved base. But she'd also added something Claire hadn't mentioned. A golden light emanating from inside the base, spreading outward in rays that touched everything around it. That's pretty, baby. What's the light? Nora looked up with perfect seriousness. That's what Graham put inside. Captain says it's love, but the kind you can hold in your hands. Claire taped the drawing to the wall above their cot. In the dim light of the shelter, the golden rays from the clock looked like sunrise. Margaret called the next morning. The lawyer's name was David Chun, estate and asset law, 20 years of experience, a reputation for discretion that bordered on paranoia. He'll see you today at 4. I've told him enough to get his attention, but not enough to compromise your position. He's expensive, Claire, but he's agreed to defer his fee until your situation is resolved. Why would he do that? Because I told him what those diamonds are worth, and he's smart enough to know that a percentage of something enormous is better than his hourly rate. The meeting with David Chun took place in his office on the 14th floor of a building downtown. The office was sleek, modern, designed to communicate success without ostentation. Chun himself was in his 40s, lean, precise, with the direct eye contact of someone who'd learned that trust was built through clarity rather than charm. Margaret Wu vouches for you. That's enough for me to listen. Tell me everything. Claire told him. All of it, this time. The numbers, the journal, the specific entries. Edith's letter. The brothers who had taken the house and left her with what they thought was worthless furniture. 5 months of homelessness while a fortune sat in a storage unit 8 miles away. Chin took notes on a legal pad, his handwriting small and precise. When Claire finished, he set down his pen and leaned back. Let me make sure I understand the legal landscape. Your grandmothers will left the house and land to your brothers. The clock was specifically designated to you under personal effects of sentimental value. Yes, and the clock's contents were not mentioned in the will. No. Chin's expression shifted. Something between professional calculation and genuine surprise. Then the contents are yours. Unambiguously. Kentucky law treats the contents of inherited property as part of the inheritance. If your grandmother left you the clock, she left you everything inside it. He paused, tapping his pen against the pad. Your brothers could argue that the clock's contents should have been declared as estate assets and divided equally. But that argument requires proving your grandmother knew about the contents and deliberately hid them from the estate process. Which she did. Chin smiled slightly. Which she may have done. But the letter is addressed to you personally, was hidden inside property legally bequeathed to you, and makes no reference to the estate. In the eyes of the law, this is a personal gift from grandmother to granddaughter, delivered through the mechanism of inherited property. Your brothers have no claim. Claire felt something loosen in her chest. A tightness she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. What do I need to do? Chin's pen moved across the pad. First, we secure the assets. That storage unit isn't adequate protection for something of this value. We need a proper facility, climate-controlled, insured, with restricted access. Second, we begin a full inventory and authentication. Every stone, every coin, every item documented and appraised by qualified professionals. Third, we establish a legal entity to hold the assets. A trust, probably, structured to protect you from tax liability and legal challenges. He looked up. And fourth, we prepare for your brothers to find out. Because they will, eventually, and when they do, they'll come for it with everything they have. The thought of Patrick and Daniel discovering what they'd dismissed made Claire's stomach tighten. How do we handle that? We build a wall so high and so legal that they can't climb over it. He leaned forward. But Claire, I need you to understand something. This is going to take time. Months, probably. During that time, you'll still be homeless. You'll still be struggling. I can advance you some funds against my eventual fee, enough to stabilize your situation, but I can't give you access to the collection until the legal framework is in place. Claire thought of Nora sleeping on a shelter cot, of Captain with his one-button eye, of the drawing with golden light spilling from the clock's base. How much can you advance? Enough for a modest apartment, deposits, first and last month's rent, basic necessities. Call it $10,000. Claire's hands started shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs. $10,000. More money than she'd held in her hands in over a year. Enough to give Nora a bed. A door that locked. A kitchen where they could cook something that didn't come from a can or a microwave. Okay, let's do it. Chin stood and extended his hand. Welcome to the most complicated inheritance case I've ever handled. Claire shook his hand, feeling the shift in her life's trajectory like the turn of a key in a lock that had been frozen for years. That evening, she picked up Nora from the shelter's children's program and knelt to meet her daughter's eyes. Nora, we're going to get an apartment. Nora's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Confusion. Hope. The careful guard of a child who had learned not to trust good news. A real one? With a door? With a door, and a kitchen, and a bathroom that's just ours. And the clock can come? Claire pulled her daughter close, feeling the small body relax against hers with a trust that was absolute and terrifying. The clock can come. It gets the best spot. By the window? By the window. They walked out of the shelter that evening carrying everything they owned in 2 duffel bags and a garbage bag. The Corolla coughed to life with the reluctance of something that had been asked to do too much for too long. The transmission made its terrible sound. The heater blew air that was barely warm. But they were driving towards something instead of away from everything, and Claire could feel the difference in her bones. Behind them, in a storage unit that cost $89 a month, a grandfather clock stood silent in the dark. Its face was cracked. Its pendulum was frozen. Its cabinet was dusty and old and unremarkable. But inside its base, hidden behind panels of carved mahogany that hadn't been opened since an old woman's hands had last touched them, $287 million waited in the patient darkness. 5 generations of Donovan women had protected this secret, carried it across oceans and through famines and into wars and out the other side, had lived modestly while fortune sat at their elbows, choosing protection over profit, patience over indulgence, legacy over luxury. Now it was Claire's turn, and she had no idea yet how heavy that responsibility would become. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Bardstown Road that had been beautiful once and was now merely functional. The carpets were thin, the walls were the color of teeth that hadn't been brushed in a while, and the kitchen faucet dripped with a rhythm that sounded like a clock ticking. But it had a door. It had a lock. It had 2 bedrooms and a bathroom and a window in the living room where the afternoon sun came through in warm rectangles that Nora immediately claimed as her reading spot. They moved in on a Tuesday. It took 1 trip. Everything they owned fit in the Corolla with room to spare, a fact that made Claire's chest ache when she thought about it too long. The apartment came furnished, barely. A sofa that sagged in the middle. A kitchen table with 3 chairs. Beds with mattresses that were adequate in the way that something is adequate when the alternative is a car seat. Nora explored every corner with Captain held aloft like a scout, surveying new territory. She tested the light switches, opened and closed the refrigerator door 4 times, flushed the toilet with ceremonial reverence. "Mama, we have our own toilet." "We do, baby." Captain is very pleased. Claire stood in the kitchen and let herself feel it. The weight of walls around her. The sound of a door she could lock. The knowledge that tonight, for the first time in 5 months, her daughter would sleep in a bed, in a room, behind a door that belonged to them. She leaned against the counter and cried. Quietly, so Nora wouldn't hear. The tears were different from the ones in the storage unit. Those had been shock and grief, and the overwhelming force of discovery. These were relief. Pure, devastating. Physical relief that loosened muscles she hadn't known were clenched and released breath she hadn't known she was holding. The next day, she arranged to move the clock. David Chun had recommended a bonded moving company that specialized in antiques. 2 men arrived at the storage unit with padded blankets and a truck that had climate control and GPS tracking. They handled the clock with the careful reverence of professionals who understood that old things were fragile and valuable and deserving of respect. Claire watched them load it, her heart hammering with every jostle and bump. They didn't know what was inside. They saw an antique grandfather clock, beautiful but damaged, worth perhaps a few $1,000s to the right collector. They didn't know they were carrying $287 million through the streets of Louisville in a truck that advertised Joe's premium moving on both sides. The clock arrived at the apartment without incident. The movers positioned it in the living room, by the window, exactly as Nora had requested. It stood against the wall like an old friend settling into a new chair, its familiar lean and its frozen pendulum and its cracked face somehow looking less broken in the afternoon light than they had in the fluorescent glare of the storage unit. Nora pressed her face against the cabinet glass. Captain pressed his one-button eye against it too. "Welcome home, clock. You can see outside now, just like I promised." Claire touched the carved base, feeling the hidden mechanisms beneath the mahogany. 12 panels of carved wood, each containing compartments that held generations of careful accumulation. Diamonds and gold and silver and coins and jewelry and the weight of a family's entire history compressed into the base of a piece of furniture. She pulled her hand back. Not yet. Not until Chun had the legal framework in place. Not until Margaret had assembled a team for proper authentication. Not until the walls were high enough and the locks were strong enough and the world was arranged in a way that protected what Edith had spent a lifetime protecting. But the clock was here. Nora was here. They had a home, however modest, however temporary in the grand scheme of what was coming. Claire made dinner that night. Real dinner. Pasta with sauce she'd made from canned tomatoes and garlic and olive oil. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, but cooked on a stove, in a kitchen, served on plates at a table where 2 chairs were occupied and the third sat empty but waiting. Nora ate with the concentrated pleasure of someone who understood that food tasted different when it came from your own kitchen. Better, somehow. More real. After dinner, Nora fell asleep on the sofa, captain under one arm, her face turned toward the clock as if its presence was a night light that kept the dark at bay. Claire covered her with a blanket from the free pile at the Salvation Army and sat on the floor beside the clock. She pressed her palm flat against the base, feeling the wood warm beneath her skin. "Graham, I found it. I'm going to protect it. I promise." The clock didn't answer. It didn't need to. Some promises were made in silence, carried in the blood, passed down through generations of women who understood that the most valuable things in the world weren't the ones people fought over. They were the ones people hid. Outside, Louisville hummed with the indifferent energy of a city that didn't know what sat in a third-floor apartment on Bardstown Road. Traffic moved. Lights changed. People went about their lives in the ordinary way that people did when they weren't sitting next to a fortune disguised as broken furniture. But somewhere across town, in a house paid for with inheritance money, Patrick Donovan's phone buzzed with a notification from the storage unit company. Account closed. Unit vacated. He stared at the message for a moment, then set his phone down and went back to watching television. He didn't think about it again. He should have. 3 weeks passed before the inventory began. 3 weeks of Nora starting school at the elementary on Frankfurt Avenue, of Claire finding part-time work at an auto parts store 6 blocks from the apartment, of mornings that started with cereal and evenings that ended with stories read on the sagging sofa, while the grandfather clock stood silent by the window, holding its secrets the way it had for 177 years. David Chun spent those weeks building the legal architecture. A trust, the Donovan Heritage Trust, established under Kentucky law with Claire as sole trustee and beneficiary. An LLC to manage any eventual sales or donations. Insurance policies drafted in language so dense that Claire's accounting brain had to read each paragraph 3 times before the meaning surfaced. Margaret Wu assembled her team. 2 additional gemologists, both retired from major auction houses, both bound by confidentiality agreements that Chun had written with the particular ferocity of a man who understood that silence was the first line of defense. A numismatist from Cincinnati who specialized in colonial-era coins. An antiquities appraiser from Nashville whose expertise covered precious metals and historical jewelry. They gathered at the apartment on a Saturday morning in January. 5 professionals, each carrying equipment in cases that clicked open with the precision of instruments designed for surgery. Nora watched from the sofa, captain in her lap, eyes wide as the strangers filled the living room with lights and loops and the focused intensity of people about to examine something extraordinary. Claire stood beside the clock, her hand resting on the carved base. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for weeks, imagining the sequence, the revelations, the numbers that would accumulate as each compartment surrendered its contents. But now that the moment had arrived, her hands were shaking and her throat was dry, and she felt less like the owner of a fortune than like the custodian of something too large to comprehend. Margaret touched her arm gently. "Whenever you're ready." Claire knelt beside the base and began the sequence. NW corner base. The 3rd circle from the top, pressed inward. The click. Hinge left panel. The raised vine section. Another click. She worked through all 12 mechanisms with the careful precision of someone disarming something dangerous, because in a way she was. Each click released another layer of protection, another barrier that Seamus and Thomas and William and Edith had placed between the world and what they were guarding. The rear panel released. Claire swung it open. The journal and the velvet pouch were where she'd left them. But this time, with Margaret's team watching, she reached deeper into the compartment and felt along the tin-lined walls. Her fingers found what she'd missed before. A small lever, flush with the tin, nearly invisible. She pulled it. The entire bottom of the compartment dropped an inch, then slid sideways, revealing a second layer beneath. A hidden compartment within a hidden compartment. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of engineering that spoke of a builder who understood that the best hiding places weren't the ones that were hard to find, but the ones that made you think you'd already found everything. The second layer held velvet-lined trays, 8 of them, stacked with the precision of a jeweler's display case. Each tray was divided into sections, and each section held stones. Margaret leaned forward, her magnified eyes catching the light from the diamonds below. She was silent for a very long time. My God! The first tray alone contained 47 diamonds. Various sizes, various cuts, all consistent with 19th-century European gem cutting. Margaret examined each one with methodical patience, calling out grades and measurements to one of her colleagues who recorded everything on a laptop. D color, internally flawless, 3. 8 carats, old European cut. D color, VVS 1, 2. 1 carats. E color, if 5. 6 carats. The numbers accumulated like snow, each one adding weight to the total that was building in the room's collective consciousness. The second tray held rubies. Deep red, some the size of Claire's thumbnail, others larger, one nearly the size of a grape. The antiquities appraiser, a quiet man named Gerald whose hands were steadier than a surgeon's, examined each one with reverence. Burmese. Pigeon blood. These haven't been on the market in decades. He looked up at Claire with an expression that mixed professional assessment with something like awe. Where did your family acquire these? Claire opened the journal to the relevant page. Edith's entry from 1978. Purchased from estate sale, Whitfield family, Lexington. Original acquisition documented as 1889, imported from Burma through London dealer. 16 stones, various sizes, accompanied by original certificate of provenance. Gerald nodded slowly. The Whitfield collection. It was rumored to have been dispersed privately. No one knew where the pieces ended up. His voice dropped. These alone are worth millions. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon, breaking only when Nora brought them sandwiches she'd made herself, peanut butter and jelly arranged on plates with the careful artistry of a child who understood that guests deserved effort. The first compartment yielded its full contents by 2 o'clock. Margaret's preliminary tally sat on the laptop screen like a number from a dream. 47 diamonds, 16 rubies, 22 sapphires, Ceylon blue, various sizes, 11 emeralds, Colombian origin, several of museum quality, 31 loose gemstones of various types, including 3 alexandrites that changed color under different lights and made Gerald whisper something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. Total estimated value of compartment 1. $43 million. And they hadn't even opened the other panels yet. Claire sat on the floor with her back against the wall and tried to breathe. The number wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Numbers like that belonged to headlines and Forbes lists and the kind of people who had never slept in a Honda Civic with their daughter and a one-eyed stuffed bear. Margaret knelt beside her. We can stop for today if you need to. Claire shook her head. If I stop, I'll be afraid to start again. They continued. The left panel of the base required a different sequence, documented in the journal's second page of instructions. 3 mechanisms hidden in the carved flowers, activated in a specific order that only someone with the journal could know. This compartment was different. No gemstones. Instead, row after row of gold coins nested in felt-lined channels. The numismatist, a woman named Dr. Patricia Holt who had published 14 books on colonial American currency, put on cotton gloves and lifted the first coin with the tenderness of someone handling a newborn. 1795 draped bust dollar. She turned it slowly, examining both sides under magnification. Mint state. Possibly the finest example I've ever seen outside of the Smithsonian. She worked through the coins one by one, her voice growing quieter with each identification as the significance of what she was seeing overwhelmed her professional composure. 1804 silver dollar. There are only 15 known examples of this coin in the world. She looked at Claire with eyes that had gone slightly unfocused. This single coin is worth between $2 and $4 million. The gold coins were next. Double eagles, sovereigns, guilders, ducats, a numismatic survey of 2 centuries of precious metal currency. Some were American, some European, some from empires that no longer existed. each one documented in the journal with the meticulous precision that had characterized every generation of Donovan record-keeping. Dr. Holt's final count for Compartment 2. 168 coins spanning 1743 to 1945. Estimated value, $61 million. The room was silent except for the scratch of pen on paper and the click of the camera shutter as Gerald documented each piece. Nora had fallen asleep on the sofa. Captain was tucked under her chin, his one button eye aimed at the ceiling. Claire looked at her daughter and thought about bus stations and shelter cots and the particular cruelty of a world that could put a child through all of that, while a fortune sat hidden in a piece of furniture her brothers had dismissed as junk. The remaining panels took 2 more days to open and catalog. Each required its own sequence, its own set of hidden mechanisms, its own entry in the journal. The craftsmanship was breathtaking. Seamus Donovan hadn't just built a hiding place. He'd built a vault disguised as furniture, a security system made of wood and brass, and engineering so precise that modern locksmiths would struggle to replicate it. The right panel held silver, ingots stamped with colonial-era hallmarks, flatware sets from European noble houses, each piece engraved with crests that Gerald traced to specific families through databases and reference books. A collection of silver coins that Dr. Holt declared the finest. Private holding she'd encountered in 30 years of practice. The front panels, 2 of them concealed behind the ornamental carving that made the clock's base look merely decorative, contained jewelry. Rings set with stones that matched the loose gems in Compartment 1. Necklaces heavy with gold and diamonds. Brooches featuring cameos carved with such skill that the faces seemed alive. A tiara, small and delicate, that Gerald identified as French, probably late 18th century, possibly connected to a minor branch of European aristocracy. And in the deepest compartment, the one accessed through a mechanism so complex it required all 12 sequences activated simultaneously, they found the collection's crown jewel. A single diamond, set in a simple gold ring, that made Margaret Wu sit down on the floor and stare at the wall for 3 full minutes. Claire. Her voice was barely audible. Do you know what this is? A ring. Margaret held it up. The stone caught the afternoon light from the window and threw rainbows across the ceiling, the walls, Nora's sleeping face. This is a type IA diamond. Extremely rare. The color is D, the clarity is internally flawless, the cut is antique cushion. She paused, her professional vocabulary failing her. It's approximately 31 carats. The number meant nothing to Claire. She knew diamonds. She knew carats. But she didn't know what 31 carats of flawless diamond meant in the context of gemological significance. Margaret saw her confusion. Claire, there are fewer than 100 diamonds of this quality and size in private hands worldwide. The last comparable stone sold at auction for $28 million. Claire's legs gave out. She sat down hard, the floor meeting her with a thump that vibrated through the apartment. $28 million. For one ring. Hidden in the base of a grandfather clock that her brothers had left behind because they thought it was worthless. The final tally came 3 days later, after Margaret's team had returned to their labs and their databases and their reference materials and verified everything against market data and auction records and the particular alchemy of supply and demand that governed the world of rare gems and precious metals. David Chin sat at Claire's kitchen table with the report spread before him. Margaret was on speakerphone. Nora was at school. The apartment was quiet except for the drip of the kitchen faucet, still unrepaired, still marking time in its own broken way. Total authenticated value, $287 million for $100,000. Claire stared at the number on the page. Edith's estimate had been almost exactly right. The old woman had known, had tracked the value with the same precision she'd applied to every other aspect of the collection's management. 70 years of careful stewardship documented in a journal that read like a financial statement from an institution, not an individual. Chin's voice was steady, but she could hear the controlled excitement beneath. This is the largest authenticated private gem and precious metals collection discovered in the United States in the last 50 years. Possibly ever. Margaret's voice came through the phone. The gemological significance alone is staggering. Several of these stones will need to be registered with international databases. The 31-carat diamond will attract attention from every major auction house in the world. Claire pressed her palms flat against the table. I'm not selling it. The The silence that followed was thick with unasked questions. Chen spoke first. Not selling any of it. Claire's voice was firm in a way that surprised even her. Edith didn't spend 70 years protecting this, so I could liquidate it. She trusted me to understand the difference between having something and using it. Margaret's voice softened. What do you want to do? Claire had been thinking about this since the first compartment was opened. Through sleepless nights and early mornings, through shifts at the auto parts store where she sorted spark plugs and brake pads while her mind turned over possibilities like a tumbler polishing stones. I want to create a foundation, a museum, eventually, something that preserves the collection intact and tells the story of how it got here. 5 generations of one family carrying this across an ocean and through a famine and into a new country and protecting it through 2 world wars and a depression and 70 years of one woman's silence. She paused. But first, I want to make sure Nora is taken care of. College fund, medical insurance, stability. I want her to never sleep in a car again. Chen nodded. We can structure that. A portion of the collection liquidated strategically to fund the trust, Nora's education, your living expenses. The rest preserved intact under the foundation. How much would I need to sell? Chen did calculations on his notepad. If we sell the silver and a selection of the lower-grade gemstones, we're looking at perhaps 15 to 20 million. That funds everything. The foundation, Nora's future, a proper facility for the collection. The crown jewels, the 31-carat diamond, the rare coins, the historically significant pieces, those stay intact. Claire felt the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. Selling even a portion felt like betrayal. But Edith had been practical above all else. She would have understood that protecting the whole sometimes meant sacrificing a part. Do it. That afternoon, Claire picked Nora up from school. They walked home through streets damp with January rain, Nora chattering about a science project involving volcanoes and baking soda. Claire listened with the particular intensity of a mother who understood that ordinary moments were the real treasure, that the weight of $287 million meant nothing compared to the weight of a 7-year-old's hand in hers. They were 2 blocks from the apartment when Claire's phone rang. Patrick. She stared at his name on the screen for 3 rings. Then she answered. Claire. His voice was the careful neutral he used when he wanted something. How are you? Fine, Patrick. Good. Listen, Karen and I were wondering if you'd like to come for dinner Sunday. Bring Nora. The kids would love to see her. The invitation was so unexpected that Claire stopped walking. Nora looked up, reading her mother's face with the practiced attention of a child who had learned to gauge adult emotions for survival. Why? Patrick's laugh was too casual. Does there need to be a reason? You're my sister. Claire's jaw tightened. She knew Patrick, knew the rhythms of his voice, the tells that distinguished genuine warmth from strategic friendliness. This was the latter. I'll think about it. Great. Sunday at 5. Karen's making pot roast. She hung up without committing. The rest of the walk home was quiet. Nora didn't ask about the call, another sign of emotional intelligence no 7-year-old should need. That night, after Nora was in bed, Claire called Chen. Patrick invited me to dinner. He never invites me to anything. Chen's voice was measured. Has anyone in your family been asking about the clock? Not that I know of. Chen paused. The storage unit company would have sent a notification when you closed the account. If Patrick was the estate executor, he might have received it. Claire's stomach dropped. He'd know I moved the clock. And he'd wonder why a homeless woman spent money to move a piece of furniture she supposedly couldn't afford to keep. The dinner invitation took on a different shape. Not generosity. Reconnaissance. Chen continued. Go to dinner. Be normal. Don't mention the clock, the collection, or anything related. If he asks about the clock, tell him it's in your apartment for sentimental reasons. Grandmother's dying wish. Nothing more. And if he pushes, then we'll know he suspects something, and we'll prepare accordingly. Sunday arrived with the particular cruelty of a day that demanded performance. Claire dressed Nora in her best clothes, which were merely her least worn clothes, and drove to Patrick's house in the suburbs. The house Edith's inheritance had helped pay for, though Patrick would never admit it. For bedrooms, a 2-car garage, a lawn that was maintained by a service whose truck Claire had seen parked in the driveway on weekday mornings when she used to drive past on her way to visit Graham. Karen opened the door with a smile that reached her mouth, but not her eyes. Claire, you look wonderful. Come in, come in. Nora, the kids are downstairs. Go play. Nora looked at her mother for permission. Claire nodded. and her daughter disappeared down the basement stairs with the cautious enthusiasm of a child entering unfamiliar territory. Patrick was in the kitchen, opening a bottle of wine that cost more than Claire's weekly grocery budget. He poured her a glass without asking if she wanted one. "Good to see you, sis. How's the new apartment?" "It's fine. Small, but fine." "And you're working? At the auto parts place?" "Yes." His expression arranged itself into something that was probably meant to look like brotherly concern, but read more like a landlord assessing a tenant. "That's good. Real good. Stability is important." Karen set the table with dishes Claire recognized. Edith's china, the set with the blue flowers that the old woman had used every Sunday for as long as Claire could remember. Seeing it in Karen's kitchen, used as everyday dinnerware by people who didn't know its history, felt like watching someone wear a dead woman's clothes. Dinner was pot roast, as promised. The conversation stayed on safe ground for the first 30 minutes. Schools, weather, the new restaurant that had opened downtown. Patrick told a story about a co-worker that was designed to make him sound important and generous simultaneously. Then, between the main course and dessert, the pivot came. "So, I got a notification from the storage place." Patrick's voice was too casual, the words rehearsed to sound spontaneous. "You moved the clock?" Claire had prepared for this. Chin's instructions echoed in her mind. "Be normal. Don't elaborate. Let him fill the silence." "Yeah, I wanted it in the apartment. Graham asked me to keep it." Patrick nodded, chewing slowly. "That old thing. Must have cost a fortune to move. Those antique movers aren't cheap." A friend helped. His eyes sharpened slightly. "A friend with a truck?" "A friend with a truck." The silence stretched. Karen busied herself clearing plates, but her movements had slowed. She was listening. Patrick leaned back in his chair. "You know, I've been thinking about Graham's stuff. The will was pretty straightforward, but I want to make sure you feel you got a fair shake." Claire's pulse quickened, but she kept her face neutral. "I got what Graham wanted me to have. A clock and some photos." Patrick's laugh was self-deprecating, a sound designed to disarm. "That doesn't seem very fair, does it?" "It's what she wanted." Patrick swirled his wine, watching it catch the light. "Karen's sister is an antiques dealer. She mentioned that old grandfather clocks can be worth quite a bit, especially ones with provenance going back to the 1800s. There it was. The reason for the dinner, the pot roast, the wine, the carefully constructed atmosphere of familial warmth. Patrick didn't suspect the contents. He suspected the clock itself was valuable, and he wanted it back. Claire set down her fork. "The clock isn't worth much. It's damaged. The face is cracked, the mechanism is seized. Still, family heirloom like that, shared heritage." Patrick's expression shifted into something that was probably meant to look earnest. "Maybe we should have it appraised. Split the value if it's worth anything." "Fair is fair." Claire met his eyes. "Graham left it to me specifically. Not to the estate. To me." The temperature in the room dropped. Karen stopped moving entirely. Patrick's jaw tightened. "I'm not trying to start a fight, Claire. I just want to make sure everything's equitable. Then give me a third of the house. A third of the savings. A third of the furniture and the silver and the books. That would be equitable." The words landed like stones in still water. Patrick's face darkened. The will was clear. "Yes, it was. The clock is mine." Claire stood. "Thank you for dinner. Nora, we're leaving." Nora appeared at the bottom of the stairs, captain in hand, reading the room with the precision of a child who had learned that adult silence meant trouble. They drove home in the quiet that follows confrontation. The streetlights slid across the windshield like slow thoughts. Nora didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She pressed Captain against the window and watched the city pass with the patience of someone who had learned that explanations came when adults were ready to give them. At the apartment, Claire called Chun. "He knows something. Not what, but something." Chin's response was immediate. "I'm accelerating the trust paperwork. Once the assets are legally secured in the foundation, it doesn't matter what Patrick suspects. He'll have no claim. How long? 2 weeks if I push. The trust documents are nearly ready. We just need the final authentication reports from Margaret's team. 2 weeks. 14 days of pretending the clock in her living room was just a clock. 14 days of waiting for Patrick to make his next move. He made it in 4. The process server arrived on a Thursday morning. Claire was getting ready for work when the knock came. She opened the door to find a young man in a polo shirt holding an envelope. "Claire Donovan?" "Yes. You've been served." The envelope contained a petition filed by Patrick and Daniel Donovan, requesting a judicial review of Edith Donovan's estate distribution. Specifically, the petition argued that the grandfather clock, as a valuable antique with historical significance, constituted an estate asset that should have been appraised and divided among all heirs. Chun read the petition over the phone while Claire sat on the floor beside the clock, her back against its base, feeling the hidden compartments through the wood like a heartbeat. It's a fishing expedition. They don't know what's inside. They just think the clock itself might be worth money and they want a piece. Can they force an appraisal? Potentially. A judge could order one if they demonstrate reasonable cause to believe the clock was undervalued in the estate distribution. And if an appraiser opens it, then we have a very different situation. Chun was quiet for a moment. Claire could hear him thinking, the particular silence of a legal mind turning over options like cards in a deck. We need to move faster. I'm filing to dismiss the petition on the grounds that the clock was a personal bequest, not an estate asset. But I'm also going to file the trust documents today. Once the collection is in the trust, it's legally separated from you personally. They can't touch it even if they win the estate case. What if the judge orders an appraisal before the trust is finalized? Then we'll need a very specific kind of appraiser. Someone who understands what they're looking at and has the discretion to handle it properly. Margaret. The next 12 days moved with the agonizing slowness of time observed too closely. Claire went to work. Nora went to school. The clock stood by the window. And behind the scenes, David Chin and Margaret Wu worked with the quiet intensity of people racing an invisible deadline. Chin filed the trust documents on a Monday. The judge received Patrick's petition on Tuesday. A hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. Claire spent the night before the hearing at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, trying to understand legal language that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. Nora came out of her room at midnight, captain dangling from one hand. Mama, are the bad things happening again? Claire pulled her daughter onto her lap. Not bad things. Complicated things. Uncle Patrick wants our clock. Claire hesitated, then chose truth over comfort. He thinks he deserves part of it. Nora's face hardened with an expression no 7-year-old should wear. Graham gave it to us. Not him. He never visited. He never listened to her stories. He just waited for her to die so he could take her stuff. The raw accuracy of a child's assessment cut through every legal argument Claire had prepared. The hearing took place in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Jefferson County Courthouse. The room was small, utilitarian, designed for the efficient resolution of disputes between people who had once been family. Patrick sat on one side with his lawyer, a man named Simmons whose suits were expensive and whose confidence bordered on arrogance. Daniel sat beside Patrick, looking uncomfortable, the silent partner in a play he hadn't fully rehearsed. Claire sat on the other side with Chun, whose calm demeanor belied the intensity of the preparation that had gone into this moment. Judge Martha Collins presided. She was in her 60s, practical, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades watching families tear themselves apart over objects and money and the ghost of love that had curdled into resentment. Simmons spoke first. Your Honor, my clients are seeking a fair and equitable distribution of their grandmother's estate. The grandfather clock in question is a family heirloom dating to 1847, with significant historical and monetary value. It was categorized as a personal effect of sentimental value in the will, a designation that undervalues the item and deprives my clients of their rightful share. Judge Collins turned to Chun. Response. Chun stood, buttoning his jacket with the deliberate calm of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Your Honor, Edith Donovan's will specifically designated the grandfather clock to Claire Donovan as a personal bequest. This is not an estate asset subject to division. Mrs. Donovan made a deliberate choice to leave this item to her granddaughter, and that choice should be respected. He placed a document before the judge. Additionally, I'd like to enter into evidence a letter written by Mrs. Donovan, found among her personal effects, in which she explicitly states her intention that the clock remain with Claire. The letter was a copy. The original remained in the clock's hidden compartment. Chun had redacted everything except the first paragraph, the one that expressed Edith's wish that Claire keep the clock. The rest, the references to the hidden contents, the warnings about Patrick and Daniel, those remained unseen. Simmons objected. We have no way to authenticate that letter. Chun smiled slightly. The handwriting has been verified by a certified document examiner. His report is included. Judge Collins read the letter, then the expert's report. Her expression remained neutral. Mr. Simmons, your clients received the house, the land, and the savings. Ms. Donovan received a clock. Even if the clock has some antique value, the distribution is heavily weighted in your client's favor. What exactly are you seeking? Simmons straightened. An independent appraisal of the clock. If its value exceeds a reasonable threshold, we request the court redistribute assets to ensure equity. Judge Collins turned to Claire. Ms. Donovan, do you object to an appraisal? Chin spoke before Claire could answer. Your Honor, my client has no objection to an appraisal of the clock as a timepiece and antique furniture piece. However, the clock contains personal items that Mrs. Donovan kept inside, as is common with heirloom furniture. We request that the appraisal be limited to the clock itself, not its contents, which were part of the personal bequest. The room went quiet. Patrick leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing. Simmons glanced at his client, then back at the judge. What kind of personal items? Chin's voice was even. Photographs, letters, family documents. Sentimental items consistent with the will's designation. Judge Collins considered this. I'll allow the appraisal of the clock as a piece of furniture and antique. Personal items inside are covered by the personal effects designation in the will and are not subject to estate review. Simmons started to object, but the judge raised a hand. Mr. Simmons, your clients inherited a house worth over $300,000, 40 acres of land, and $67,000 in savings. Ms. Donovan inherited a clock. If you want to argue inequity, you might want to consider which side of this table it sits on. The appraisal was scheduled for the following week. Margaret Wu was approved as the independent appraiser, her credentials accepted by both parties. She arrived at the apartment on a Wednesday, carrying her equipment case, her expression carefully neutral. Patrick had insisted on being present. He stood in the living room with Simmons, watching as Margaret examined the clock's exterior with professional thoroughness. She measured dimensions, examined the wood grain, the joinery, the quality of the carving. She studied the clock face, the mechanism, the pendulum. She took photographs from every angle, made notes in a leather-bound pad, and generally behaved like someone assessing a piece of furniture that was interesting but not extraordinary. After 40 minutes, she delivered her findings. The clock is a mid-19th century American grandfather clock, likely constructed between 1840 and 1850. The mahogany is high quality, the carving is skilled but not exceptional by period standards. The mechanism is non-functional and would require significant restoration. She paused, consulting her notes. Comparable pieces at auction sell for between $8,000 and $12,000. Given the damage to the face and mechanism, I'd place this piece at the lower end. Approximately $7,000 to $9,000. Patrick's face fell. The number was too small to justify the legal effort. Simmons shifted uncomfortably. That's it. Patrick's voice carried the particular frustration of someone who had expected more. It's an 1847 antique from Ireland. Margaret's expression remained professional. Age alone doesn't determine value. Condition, maker, provenance, rarity, all factor in. This is a well-made but unremarkable example of the type. She looked at Patrick with eyes that gave away nothing. I can provide a written report if you'd like. Patrick stared at the clock, at the cracked face and the frozen pendulum and the carved base that looked like nothing more than ornamental woodwork. His jaw worked as he processed the disappointment. Simmons leaned close and whispered something. Patrick's expression hardened, then deflated. Fine. He turned to Claire, and for a moment, something almost human flickered in his eyes. Keep the clock, Claire. I'm sorry about all this. He left without saying goodbye to Nora, who watched from her bedroom doorway with Captain pressed against her chest. After they were gone, Margaret sat on the sofa and let out a breath she'd been holding for an hour. 7,000 to 9,000. That was the longest 40 minutes of my professional life. Claire sat beside her. Her legs were trembling. Thank you. Margaret looked at the clock, at the hidden compartments behind the carved panels, at the $287 million concealed inside what she'd just declared was worth less than a used car. Your grandmother was the most brilliant woman I've never met. That evening, Chin called with news. Patrick's petition had been withdrawn. The judge had accepted Margaret's appraisal. The trust documents were finalized. The Donovan Heritage Trust was now the legal owner of the collection, with Claire as sole trustee. It's done, Claire. They can't touch it. Even if they find out tomorrow, The legal structure is airtight. Claire hung up and sat on the floor beside the clock. Nora climbed into her lap, captain between them. Are the complicated things over? Some of them. There are more coming. The bigger kind? Claire kissed the top of her daughter's head. The bigger kind. But tonight, we're safe? Tonight, we're safe. Nora settled against her mother, her breathing slowing toward sleep. The clock towered above them, silent and solid and full of secrets that would change everything when the world finally learned what a homeless woman and her grandmother had been protecting. Outside, Louisville moved through its evening routines. Traffic lights changed. Restaurant doors opened and closed. People walked dogs and checked phones and lived their lives in the ordinary way that people do when they don't know that something extraordinary is happening 3 floors above a street they pass every day without looking up. Patrick drove home in silence. Karen asked how it went. He said the clock was worthless and changed the subject. But something nagged at him as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. Something about the way Claire had looked at the clock. Not like someone looking at a piece of furniture. Like someone looking at a responsibility. He pushed the thought away, turned over, closed his eyes. He should have listened to it. 3 months passed. Spring arrived in Louisville with the aggressive beauty of a season that had been waiting too long. Dogwoods bloomed along Bardstown Road. The Ohio River softened from winter gray to spring green. Nora's school had a talent show where she recited a poem about a clock that kept secrets, and her teacher called Claire to say it was the most original piece any student had submitted that year. Claire continued working at the auto parts store, maintaining the routine of ordinary life while behind the scenes, the extraordinary unfolded with methodical precision. She negotiated the first sale, a selection of silver ingots and lower-grade gemstones, handled through a private dealer Margaret recommended, a woman in New York who moved in circles where discretion was currency and provenance was everything. The sale brought $4. $3 million. Claire sat in Chen's office and stared at the deposit confirmation. The number on the screen bore no relationship to any number she'd ever seen attached to her name. Her checking account had held $214 3 months ago. Now the trust account held a figure that made the room feel like it was tilting. The first thing we do is stabilize your life. Chen walked her through the allocations. Nora's college fund, fully funded. Medical insurance, comprehensive. Emergency fund, 6 months of living expenses. Apartment upgrade when you're ready. I don't want to move yet. Nora settled. She has friends. Chen nodded approvingly. Smart. Keep the same life. Change nothing visible. The moment your lifestyle changes, questions start. Claire agreed, but the strain of pretending was beginning to show. She sorted spark plugs at the auto parts store while knowing she could buy the entire chain. She clipped coupons at the grocery store while knowing the trust account earned more in interest each day than she spent in a month. She sat on the sagging sofa and watched Nora do homework and felt the bizarre dislocation of being simultaneously poor and wealthy, visible and hidden, ordinary and extraordinary. The second sale followed 6 weeks later. Colonial-era coins that Dr. Holt placed through numismatic auction houses. Each sale handled as a separate transaction to avoid attracting attention. Total from the second round of sales, $8. $7 million. The trust now held enough to fund the foundation for decades. Claire began planning the next phase. A proper facility for the collection, climate-controlled storage, security systems, the infrastructure required to protect something of this scale. Margaret introduced her to Dr. James Thornton, a museum consultant who had designed exhibits for the Smithsonian and the Met. He was in his 70s, white-haired, soft-spoken, with the particular gentleness of someone who had spent a lifetime handling things more fragile and more valuable than himself. They met at the apartment. James sat on the sofa and studied the clock with professional interest. When Claire explained what was inside, she showed him the journal, the authentication reports, the photographs of each compartment's contents, and he didn't speak for a very long time. Finally, he looked at her. This is the most significant private collection I've encountered in 50 years of museum work. The historical value alone, the story of a family carrying this across an ocean, protecting it through generations, is irreplaceable. What would you recommend? A dedicated facility. Not a vault, a museum. Something that tells the story as much as it displays the objects. The Donovan journey from Ireland to America. The clock as a symbol of persistence and protection. The collection as evidence of what ordinary people can accomplish through patience and dedication. He pulled out a sketchbook and began drawing, rough lines that suggested architecture. Something here in Louisville, connected to the community, educational programs, scholarship funds, a living institution rather than a static display. Claire watched him sketch. How much would something like that cost? Properly done, 15 to 20 million. But you'd attract donors, grants, public funding. The story alone would generate interest. The story. Claire thought about Edith alone in the farmhouse, about Seamus on the docks of New York, about every generation that had added to the clock's hidden chambers and said nothing to anyone. The story was extraordinary, but it was also private. Sharing it meant losing control of it. Can I tell the story without revealing everything? Keep some of the collection private? James nodded. Many major collections maintain private holdings. You display what serves the educational mission and preserve the rest. Claire looked at the clock, at the carved base with its 12 hidden mechanisms and its tin-lined compartments and its $287 million of accumulated patience. Let's do it. That evening, she told Nora, "Baby, I need to tell you something about the clock." Nora looked up from her homework, Captain perched on the desk beside her math worksheet. "You found Graham's treasure." Claire blinked. "You knew?" Captain knew. He said the clock was too heavy to be empty. And you look at it different than you look at other furniture. Like it's alive. Claire sat on Nora's bed, overwhelmed by the casual perceptiveness of a child who had spent her formative years reading adult emotions for survival cues. Graham hid something very valuable inside the clock. Jewels and coins and precious metals. A lot of it. How much? Claire hesitated. Enough to change our lives. Nora was quiet for a moment, processing with the seriousness she applied to all important matters. Are we going to keep it? Some of it. The rest, we're going to share with the world. Build a museum. Tell Graham's story. Nora nodded as if this made perfect sense. Can Captain be in the museum? Claire laughed, a real laugh. The kind that started in her belly and rose through her chest and came out sounding like something she'd forgotten she was capable of. Captain gets his own exhibit. Good. He's very historical. That night, after Nora was asleep, Claire sat alone with the clock. She opened the journal to Edith's final entry and read it again by lamplight. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't do more while I was alive. But this is my doing more. This is everything. Claire picked up a pen and added her own entry beneath Edith's words. Day 97 since discovery. The trust is established. The collection is secure. Patrick tried to take it and failed. I found allies. Margaret, David, James. I found strength I didn't know I had. I'm going to build something worthy of what you protected, Graham. Something that lasts. Something that matters. Nora knows. She said Captain already figured it out. You would have loved her, Graham. She's braver than all of us. She closed the journal and pressed her palm against the clock's base, feeling the wood warm beneath her skin. Tomorrow, she would begin planning the museum. Tomorrow, she would take the first steps toward turning a family secret into a public legacy. Tomorrow, the world would start to learn what a grandmother's love looked like when it was measured not in words but in diamonds hidden inside a grandfather clock that everyone else had thrown away. But tonight, the apartment was quiet and Nora was safe, and the clock stood by the window where it could see outside, just like she'd promised. And somewhere in the suburbs, Patrick Donovan slept soundly, dreaming of nothing in particular, confident he had gotten the better deal. He hadn't. He never would. The news broke on a Tuesday in June. Not through Claire's doing. Not through Chun or Margaret or James or anyone connected to the plan they'd been building with the careful patience of architects designing a cathedral. It broke because of Helen Weiss, Karen's sister, the antiques dealer who had first whispered in Patrick's ear about the clock's potential value. Helen ran a shop in the Highlands that catered to wealthy collectors and interior designers, the kind of woman who knew the price of everything and the value of very little. She had contacts at auction houses, relationships with private dealers, a network that pulsed with information about sales and acquisitions and the movement of rare objects through the private market. Someone in that network had noticed the silver sales. Someone had traced the provenance documents back to the name Donovan. Someone had called Helen and asked if she knew anything about an Irish-American family selling authenticated colonial-era silver through a private dealer in Manhattan. Helen called Patrick. Patrick called Daniel. Daniel, who had never been able to keep a secret, told his wife. His wife told her book club. Her book club included a woman whose husband was a reporter for the Louisville Courier-Journal. The call came at 7 in the morning. Claire was making breakfast, eggs and toast, the routine of a life that still looked ordinary from the outside. "Ms. Donovan, this is Rachel Torres from the Courier-Journal. I'm working on a story about a significant private collection of gems and precious metals connected to your family. Would you like to comment?" Claire's hand froze mid-motion, the spatula suspended above the pan. The eggs began to burn. She could smell them, the sharp scent of something going wrong. "I don't know what you're talking about. Ms. Donovan, I have sources indicating that a collection worth upwards of $200 million has been authenticated and partially sold through private channels. The collection is linked to a Donovan family heirloom, specifically a grandfather clock inherited from your grandmother, Edith Donovan." The precision of the information told Claire everything she needed to know. This wasn't speculation. Someone had talked. Someone who knew details. Her stomach clenched. "I have no comment." She hung up and called Chun. "They know. Someone leaked. The reporter has details, David. Specific numbers, the clock, everything." Chin's response was immediate and controlled, the voice of a man who had planned for this contingency, even while hoping it wouldn't arrive. "I'll contact the reporter. Invoke attorney-client privilege where possible. But, Claire, once media picks this up, it spreads fast. We need to get ahead of it." "What does that mean?" "It means we control the narrative or someone else will." The story ran the next morning. Front page, below the fold, with the headline that Claire would see in her nightmares for years. "Hidden fortune, homeless mother discovers $287 million treasure in grandmother's clock." The article was thorough. Rachel Torres had done her research. She'd traced the silver sales, confirmed the trust's existence through public records, interviewed numismatic experts who spoke on background about colonial-era coins of extraordinary rarity entering the market through an unknown private collection. She'd found the appraisal records from Margaret's initial assessment. She'd even obtained a quote from Helen Weiss, who described the collection as historically unprecedented and mentioned that her brother-in-law had been unfairly excluded from the inheritance. By noon, Claire's phone had 47 missed calls. By 2 o'clock, news vans were parked on Bardstown Road outside her building. By 4, she'd received interview requests from 3 national networks, 2 podcast producers, a book agent, and a man who claimed to be from the Smithsonian, but whose email address ended in a domain she'd never heard of. Nora came home from school bewildered. "There are people with cameras outside. Mrs. Patterson said I'm famous." Claire pulled the curtains and turned off the lights. They sat in the dim apartment, the clock looming in the shadows by the window, while the world pressed against their door. Chin arrived at 6 with a plan. "We go public on our terms. 1 interview, carefully controlled. You tell your story, your grandmother's story, before anyone else can tell it for you." Claire's instinct was to hide, to lock the door and wait for the storm to pass. But Chin was right. Silence would be filled by other voices, Patrick's voice, Helen's voice, the voice of anyone who wanted to shape the narrative for their own purposes. She agreed. The interview aired 3 days later. National Network, morning show, a host who was known for human interest stories and had the particular skill of making guests feel comfortable enough to be honest. Claire sat in a chair across from the host, wearing clothes Margaret had helped her choose, not expensive, not flashy, just clean and presentable and appropriate for a woman who was about to tell the world something impossible. "Tell me about the clock." Claire took a breath. "My grandmother Edith was the strongest woman I ever knew. She raised a family, survived a depression, worked her whole life, and never asked anyone for anything. When she died, my brothers inherited the house and the land and the money. I got a grandfather clock. And what was inside that clock? 5 generations of a family's love wrapped in diamonds." The interview lasted 20 minutes. Claire told the story simply, honestly, without embellishment. The famine. Seamus carrying the clock on his back. Each generation adding to the collection, protecting it, passing it forward. Edith's letter. The hidden compartments with their 12 mechanisms. The discovery made by a woman who was sleeping in shelters while a fortune sat in a storage unit. When she described the moment she opened the first compartment, when she described the diamonds falling into her palm, the host's eyes glistened. The camera operators were silent. The studio felt like a church. "Your brothers didn't know. My grandmother chose not to tell them. She trusted me because I was the one who showed up. Every Sunday for 6 years. I sat at her table and listened to her stories while my brothers counted the days until they could sell her house. The words were harsher than Claire had planned, but they were true, and truth had a gravity that pulled everything toward it. The interview went viral. Within hours, Claire Donovan was a name recognized by millions. The clock, the diamonds, the homeless mother, the greedy brothers, the grandmother's secret. The story had everything the internet craved: injustice and redemption, and the kind of reversal that made people believe the world might occasionally get things right. Patrick appeared on a competing network the next day, his expression arranged into wounded innocence. "I love my sister. I'm happy for her. We just wish grandmother had been more transparent about the family's assets so they could have been shared equitably." The internet's response was swift and merciless. Patrick Donovan became the face of entitlement, the brother who took the house and left his homeless sister with a clock, who tried to take the clock back when he thought it might be worth a few $1,000s, who now wanted a share of millions he'd done nothing to earn and nothing to protect. Daniel issued a statement through a lawyer, claiming he had been unaware of Patrick's legal challenges and expressing support for Claire's right to the inheritance. The statement was widely interpreted as a man abandoning a sinking ship, which is exactly what it was. Claire watched all of this from the apartment with the curtains drawn, Nora beside her, Captain between them, the clock standing sentinel by the window that no longer let in light because the cameras outside turned every opening into an invasion. She thought about Edith alone in the farmhouse, protecting this secret for 70 years. She thought about the price of that protection: the isolation, the silence, the loneliness of knowing something extraordinary while living an ordinary life. Now Claire understood why her grandmother had waited until death to share the burden. Not because she was afraid of the treasure being found, but because she was afraid of what finding it would cost. The price was privacy. The price was peace. The price was the ordinary life that had just been stripped away, replaced by something Claire hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. She pressed her hand against the clock's base, feeling the hidden compartments through the wood. The mechanisms clicked softly under her palm, tiny sounds that only she could hear, like a heartbeat, like a promise, like the ticking of time that had stopped for everyone else, but never stopped for the Donovan women who carried this weight through centuries. $287 million. And the only thing Claire wanted was to go back to the moment before the phone rang, when the eggs were cooking and the morning was quiet and Nora was getting ready for school, and the secret was still a secret, and the clock was just a clock standing by the window where it could see outside. But you couldn't go back. You could only go forward. And forward meant the museum, the foundation, the public legacy that would transform a family's secret into the world's inheritance. Forward meant becoming the woman Edith had trusted her to be. Claire squared her shoulders. She opened the curtains. She looked directly into the cameras gathered below. And she began. The weeks that followed the interview were a siege. Not the kind fought with weapons or barricades, but the quieter kind, the kind that pressed against windows and slid under doors and hummed through phone lines at all hours with the relentless persistence of water finding cracks in stone. Claire learned to categorize the callers the way a triage nurse categorizes patients. The reporters came first, relentless, competitive, each one certain that their angle was the one Claire hadn't considered, the one that would make her open up and reveal something the others had missed. She declined them all. One interview had been enough. One interview had already cost her the ability to walk down Bardstown Road without being recognized, photographed, approached by strangers who felt entitled to her story because they'd watched it on a screen. Then came the opportunists. Financial advisors with plans to multiply her fortune. Investment bankers with proposals wrapped in language designed to make theft sound like partnership. Real estate developers who wanted to build the museum and take 60% of the revenue. A man from Los Angeles who introduced himself as a producer and promised to make her story into a movie that would change the world, by which he meant his bank balance. Then came the distant relatives. People Claire had never heard of, Donovans from 6 states and 2 countries, each with a genealogy chart and a claim that their branch of the family had been unfairly excluded from the inheritance. A woman in Boston insisted she was Seamus Donovan's direct descendant through a son no one had documented. A man in Ireland sent a letter, handwritten, claiming the gems had been stolen from his family during the famine and demanding restitution. Chen handled the legal threats. Margaret handled the authentication challenges. James Thornton handled the museum inquiries, and Claire handled Nora, which was the only job that mattered and the only one she refused to delegate. Nora adapted the way children do, with a flexibility that looked like resilience but was really just the absence of a frame of reference for normal. She told her classmates that her mama had found treasure in a clock, and they believed her because children believe extraordinary things more easily than adults do. She drew pictures of the clock surrounded by diamonds and hung them on the refrigerator with magnets shaped like fruit. She asked Claire every night if the clock was safe, and every night Claire said yes. And every night Nora accepted the answer with the trust of someone who had decided that her mother's word was the most reliable thing in an unreliable world. The security upgrade came 3 weeks after the interview aired. Chen had insisted, and Claire had resisted until the morning she found a man in the building's lobby claiming to be a plumber but carrying no tools. The man left when she confronted him, walking to a car with out-of-state plates that pulled away too quickly for someone on legitimate business. The new apartment was on the 8th floor of a building downtown with a doorman and a security desk and cameras in the elevators. It had 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with countertops that didn't peel, and windows that looked out over the river. The rent was more than Claire had earned in a month at the auto parts store, but the trust covered it without strain. She quit the auto parts store on a Friday. Her manager, a kind man named Ray who had never asked why a woman with an accounting degree was sorting spark plugs, shook her hand and said he'd always known she was meant for bigger things. Bigger things. The phrase felt wrong. The things that mattered most to Claire were small. Nora's laugh when Captain fell off the bed. The way morning light came through the new apartment's windows and made the hardwood floors glow like honey. The sound of the clock ticking because she'd had it repaired, the mechanism restored by a horologist Margaret knew, and now it kept time again for the first time in decades. The pendulum swung. The hands moved. The clock that had been frozen for years was alive again, marking seconds and minutes and hours in the steady rhythm of something that had finally been given permission to breathe. Nora had cried when it started ticking. Not sad crying. The other kind. The kind that comes when something broken becomes whole again and you realize that repair is possible, that damage isn't always permanent, that things and people and lives can be put back together if someone cares enough to try. The museum planning consumed Claire's days. James Thornton brought architects and designers and exhibition specialists to meetings that lasted hours, each one layering detail upon detail until the vision took shape like a sculpture emerging from stone. The site was a former tobacco warehouse on Main Street, a massive brick structure with original timber beams and industrial windows that let in the kind of light museums needed. The building had been empty for 8 years, another casualty of an economy that had moved on from the industries that built Louisville. Chen negotiated the purchase for $2. $1 million, a fraction of its potential value, but fair for a structure that needed significant renovation. The design honored the clock. James understood, perhaps better than anyone else on the team, that the collection was secondary to the story. The gems and coins and jewelry were extraordinary, but they were objects. The story was human. The story was a family that crossed an ocean with a secret, that protected it through famine and war and depression, that chose patience over profit for 177 years. The museum's central gallery would hold the clock itself, restored to its full beauty, the mahogany polished to a deep shine, the face repaired, the carvings highlighted with careful lighting that revealed the hidden mechanisms without activating them. Visitors would see the clock as it appeared to the world, a beautiful but unremarkable piece of furniture. Then, through interactive displays and guided tours, they would learn what was inside. Surrounding galleries would tell the story chronologically. Seamus Donovan's journey from Ireland, documented through historical records and family letters that Claire had found tucked between pages of the journal. Thomas Donovan's additions during Prohibition, when the family had quietly converted cash into gems through contacts in Chicago's underground economy. William Donovan's contributions from his service in Europe, where he'd encountered displaced families selling heirlooms for passage money and had purchased pieces not as speculation but as preservation, saving beautiful things from the fire of war. And Edith's 70 years of patient accumulation, documented in the journal with the precision of a woman who understood that legacy required records. The collection itself would be displayed in climate-controlled cases with the kind of security systems that made bank vaults look casual. Margaret supervised the installation personally, positioning each piece with the care of a woman who understood that context mattered as much as content. The 31-carat diamond, the collection's crown jewel, would occupy a case of its own in the central gallery, lit from above by a single focused beam that made the stone look like a captured star. But Claire insisted on one addition that James hadn't planned: a gallery dedicated to the years of homelessness. Photographs of the shelters, the car, the bus stations. Nora's drawings from that period, stick figures in oversized coats standing beside a rectangle that was clearly a car. The peanut butter jars and the off-brand apple juice and the donated clothes that never quite fit. The reality of what it meant to be invisible in a country that celebrated wealth while ignoring the people who had none. James had questioned the choice. It's powerful, but it's painful. Are you sure you want that part of your life on display? Claire's answer had been immediate. The whole point is that I was sleeping in a car while the clock was in storage. That's the story. That's the part that makes people understand what Edith did and why it matters. She didn't hide the treasure from the world. She hid it from people who would have wasted it. She waited for someone who would understand. The gallery stayed. Construction began in April. The groundbreaking ceremony was small, intentional. Claire drove a shovel into the earth behind the warehouse while Nora held Captain aloft like a mascot, overseeing proceedings. Margaret took photographs. Chin stood to the side with the satisfied expression of a man watching legal architecture become physical architecture. The first weeks were demolition. Workers stripped the warehouse interior to its bones, revealing timber beams so massive they looked like the ribs of something ancient. The brick walls, cleaned of decades of industrial grime, emerged the color of dried blood, rich and warm and heavy with the particular beauty of things that had survived their original purpose. Claire visited the site every day, watching the transformation with the same careful attention she'd once given to Edith's stories, absorbing every detail, understanding that what they were building was not just a museum, but a monument to the particular kind of love that expresses itself through secrecy and sacrifice. Nora came with her on weekends, hard hat perched comically on her small head, Captain tucked into the pocket of her jacket. She had opinions about everything. The lighting in the gym gallery should be blue because diamonds look better in blue light. The children's section should have a treasure hunt where kids could find hidden compartments in replica furniture. The gift shop should sell stuffed bears with button eyes because not everyone could afford fancy toys and everyone deserved something soft to hold. The construction manager, a practical woman named Deborah who had built hospitals and courthouses and had no patience for sentiment, listened to Nora's suggestions with unexpected seriousness. The kids got better instincts than half my design team. She incorporated every one of Nora's ideas. Meanwhile, the legal aftermath of the media exposure continued to unspool. Patrick hired a new lawyer, more aggressive than Simmons, a woman named Victoria Cross who specialized in estate disputes and had a reputation for finding leverage where none appeared to exist. Cross filed a series of motions challenging the Donovan Heritage Trust's legitimacy. She argued that the clock's contents constituted hidden estate assets that Edith had deliberately concealed from the probate process. She argued that Claire had engaged in fraud by commissioning an appraisal that intentionally undervalued the clock. She argued that the trust had been established specifically to circumvent Patrick and Daniel's rightful inheritance claims. The motions were thorough, well-researched, and ultimately unsuccessful. Chun dismantled each one with the methodical precision of an engineer disassembling a machine to show it couldn't work. The clock was a personal bequest. Personal bequests include contents. Kentucky law is clear on this point. The appraisal assessed the clock as a piece of furniture, which is exactly what was requested. The contents were protected under the personal effects designation. The trust was established after the estate was settled. It holds assets that belong solely to Ms. Donovan, acquired through legal inheritance. Mr. Donovan has no standing to challenge the disposition of property that was never his. Judge Collins, who had overseen the original hearing, grew increasingly impatient with each filing. At the fourth hearing, she addressed Cross directly. "Counselor, your clients inherited a house, 40 acres, and $67,000. Ms. Donovan inherited a clock. The fact that the clock turned out to be more valuable than anyone expected does not retroactively entitle your clients to a share. If Mr. Donovan found oil beneath his inherited property, would Ms. Donovan be entitled to a portion?" Cross hesitated. That's different, Your Honor. It is not different. Inherited property belongs to the heir. Its contents, whether expected or unexpected, belong to the heir. Your motions are denied. If you file another without substantially new evidence, I'll consider sanctions. Patrick was in the courtroom for that hearing. Claire saw him as she left, sitting in the gallery with the particular stillness of a man watching something he wanted slip irreversibly beyond his reach. His lawyer sat beside him, already packing her briefcase with the efficient movements of someone closing a file she knew would not be reopened. Karen was absent. She had stopped attending hearings after the second one, her support for Patrick's crusade eroding under the weight of legal fees that consumed more money each month than the clock would have been worth even if Margaret's appraisal had been generous. The irony was not lost on Claire. Patrick had spent more fighting for a share of the clock than the clock was supposedly worth as furniture. He had poured tens of thousands of dollars into lawyers and filings and motions, chasing a prize he didn't understand, driven by the instinct of a man who sensed he had been outmaneuvered but couldn't articulate how. Their eyes met. For a moment, the years compressed, and Claire saw not the greedy brother who had taken the house and left her with nothing, but the boy who had pushed her on the swing set behind the farmhouse, who had caught fireflies with her in Edith's garden, who had been her protector before he became her adversary. She remembered a specific day, summer, the air thick with humidity and the smell of fresh-cut grass. Patrick was 15, Claire was 11. Some older boys from town had been throwing rocks at a bird's nest in Edith's oak tree. Patrick had walked across the yard, said 3 words Claire couldn't. Remember, and the boys had left. He'd climbed the tree afterward and checked on the nest, reporting back that the eggs were safe. That boy still existed somewhere inside the man who sat in the courtroom. Claire had to believe that. The alternative was accepting that people could be entirely replaced by worse versions of themselves, and she wasn't ready to live in that world. Patrick looked away first. In the hallway, Daniel was waiting. He looked different from the last time Claire had seen him. Thinner, older, the bravado stripped away to reveal someone who had spent months watching his brother's obsession consume them both. Claire, can we talk? She almost refused. Shin had advised against any communication with the brothers outside of legal channels. But something in Daniel's voice, something broken and honest and exhausted, made her stop. They sat on a bench in the courthouse hallway while lawyers and clerks and the machinery of justice moved around them like water around stones. I want you to know I didn't want any of this. Daniel's voice was hoarse. Patrick pushed the lawsuit. I just went along because he's my brother, and that's what I've always done. Gone along. Claire waited. Daniel stared at his hands. When Graham died, I felt relieved. That's the truth. I felt relieved because I thought the house would give me a fresh start. Pay off some debts. Maybe fix things with my marriage. He looked up. I didn't think about you. I didn't think about what you were going through. I knew you were struggling, and I didn't care enough to help. His eyes were red. That's worse than what Patrick did. Patrick's greedy. I was just indifferent. And indifference is crueler than greed because at least greedy people acknowledge you exist. Claire's chest ached. The anger she'd carried toward Daniel had always been different from what she felt toward Patrick. Patrick's betrayal was active, intentional, loud. Daniel's was passive, absent, silent. The brother who didn't show up, who didn't call, who didn't think about her daughter sleeping in a car because thinking about it would have required him to do something about it. What do you want, Daniel? His laugh was bitter. Nothing I deserve. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. Not because of the money. Because of Nora. She's 7 years old, and I've never given her a birthday present. I didn't come to her school play. I didn't know she had a stuffed bear named Captain until I read it in the newspaper. He stood, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I'm dropping out of the lawsuit. Patrick can fight alone. I'm done. He walked away. Claire sat on the bench for a long time after he left, feeling the complicated weight of forgiveness pressing against the underside of her ribs. Not ready to let it out. Not ready to hold it in. Just aware of its presence, like a stone in her shoe that she'd learned to walk with. Summer arrived in Louisville with its characteristic intensity, heat rising from pavement in visible waves, thunderstorms rolling through like scheduled performances. The museum construction progressed on schedule, the warehouse transforming week by week from empty shell to purposeful space. Claire hired her first employee. a young woman named Keisha Washington who had just graduated from the University of Louisville with a degree in museum studies and a thesis on community-based cultural institutions. Keisha was organized, passionate, and entirely unfazed by the scale of what they were building. Most museums start with a building and try to find a collection. You're starting with the most incredible collection I've ever seen and building everything around it. Do you know how rare that is? Claire smiled. Rare seems to be our specialty. Margaret Wu transitioned from consultant to chief curator, overseeing the installation of display systems and conservation protocols. She trained a small staff of technicians in handling procedures, each one vetted through background checks that Chen supervised personally. Dr. Holt established a research program, opening the numismatic collection to scholars who traveled from as far as London and Tokyo to study coins they'd only read about in textbooks. The 1804 silver dollar alone generated 3 academic papers before the museum even opened. James Thornton's design came together with the inevitability of something that had always existed in potential and was only now being made visible. The tobacco warehouse retained its industrial character, the brick and timber providing a rough-hewn backdrop that made the gleaming display cases feel like discoveries rather than presentations. You didn't walk into the Donovan Heritage Museum and feel like you were being shown something. You felt like you were finding it, the way Claire had found it, one compartment at a time. The central gallery held the clock in a case of bulletproof glass, surrounded by a circular walkway that allowed visitors to see it from every angle. 12 stations around the walkway corresponded to the 12 hidden mechanisms, each one featuring interactive displays that explained how the compartments worked, what they contained, and who had placed those contents there. The flanking galleries unfolded the family's history in immersive detail. Seamus Donovan's passage from Cork to New York, illustrated with period artifacts and historical accounts of famine ships. Thomas Donovan's Prohibition-era dealings, presented without judgment, allowing visitors to understand the moral complexity of survival in desperate times. William Donovan's war service, his medals displayed alongside the jewelry he'd saved from destruction, each piece accompanied by whatever provenance he'd been able to document, a reminder that beautiful things survived only because someone chose to save them. Edith's gallery was Claire's favorite. Photographs of the farmhouse. The kitchen table where they'd shared coffee every Sunday. The chair where Edith had sat while telling stories Claire had thought were just stories. The journal, open to selected pages. Edith's handwriting preserved behind glass. Her words speaking across the boundary of death with the clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime learning what mattered and what didn't. And the homelessness gallery. Small, deliberately intimate, designed not to inspire pity but understanding. Claire had been reluctant to include personal photographs, but Nora had insisted. People need to see that we were real, Mama, not just a story on television. Real people who were scared and cold and didn't know what was going to happen next. Nora's drawings hung on the walls. A car with 2 figures sleeping inside, stars visible through the windshield. A shelter bed with a bear on the pillow. A clock standing alone in a dark room, waiting. Each drawing bore the date and location where it had been created, a child's cartography of displacement that was more powerful than any professional exhibition design could have achieved. The opening was scheduled for October 15th, almost exactly 1 year after Claire had first walked into the storage unit and seen the clock leaning against the corrugated metal wall. Invitations went out to museum directors, gemological societies, historical organizations, media outlets, community leaders, and every family in Louisville that Claire had connected with during her months of homelessness. The shelter workers who had processed her intake. The security guard at the bus station who had pretended not to see them sleeping on the bench. The librarian named Harold who had directed her to the reference section without questions. Ray from the auto parts store. And one invitation, hand-delivered, to the farmhouse outside Lexington where Patrick still lived. Claire drove out on a Sunday afternoon, the road familiar from 6 years of weekly visits to Edith. The house looked different now. Patrick had replaced the porch railing and painted the shutters and installed new windows that gleamed with the particular blankness of things that had no history. The garden where Edith had grown vegetables and told stories was now lawn, mowed to uniform height, stripped of the wildness that had made it beautiful. Patrick answered the door. His expression was difficult to read. Surprise, maybe. Wariness. The particular vulnerability of someone who has spent months attacking and is suddenly confronted with the person they attacked standing on their porch without weapons. Claire. She handed him the envelope. I'm opening the museum next month. I want you to come. Patrick looked at the invitation, then at Claire. His jaw worked. Why? Because Graham would have wanted you there. Because you're my brother. Because this collection belongs to our family's history, and you're part of that history whether I like it or not. Patrick leaned against the doorframe. The posture was defensive, but his eyes held something she hadn't seen there in years. Shame, maybe, or the beginning of it. I tried to take it from you. Yes, I would have sold every piece within a year. I know, and you're inviting me anyway. Claire met his eyes. Graham protected this collection for 70 years. She hid it from you because she knew exactly what you'd do with it. But she didn't hate you, Patrick. She was disappointed. There's a difference. Patrick flinched. The word landed where she'd aimed it, in the space between what he was and what he could have been. I don't deserve to be there. Probably not. But Nora wants to meet her uncle. She's never really known you. She'd like to. The silence stretched. Somewhere inside the house, Karen's voice called out, asking who was at the door. Patrick didn't answer. I'll think about it. Claire nodded. That's all I'm asking. She drove home with the windows down, letting the October air fill the car with the scent of turned leaves and cooling earth and the particular melancholy of a season that was beautiful precisely because it was ending. Opening day arrived in a wash of golden autumn light that made the warehouse's brick facade glow like something lit from within. The street outside had been closed for the event, lined with food trucks and craft vendors, and a children's activity station where kids could search for hidden compartments in oversized wooden blocks. A local bluegrass band played near the entrance, their music drifting through the open doors like an invitation written in melody. The mayor gave a speech about economic development and cultural pride, words that sounded rehearsed but carried genuine enthusiasm. Margaret stood beside Claire during the ceremony, her eyes moving between the building she'd helped fill and the crowds already forming lines at the entrance. Whatever happens from here, she said quietly, leaning close enough that only Claire could hear, you've done something that most people spend their entire careers dreaming about. You've given context to beauty. That's the hardest thing in the world. Claire didn't trust herself to respond. She nodded and focused on breathing. The ribbon cutting was performed by two people. Claire held one handle of the oversized scissors. Nora held the other. Captain was wedged between them, his one button eye capturing the flash of cameras and the applause that followed the cut. Afterward, Claire stood inside the central gallery, alone, in the hour before the doors opened to the public. The clock stood in its case, the pendulum swinging, the mechanism ticking, keeping time in a space that had been designed to hold it the way a cathedral was designed to hold faith. She pressed her hand against the glass, felt the vibration of the mechanism through the barrier. The clock was alive again, surrounded by the story it had carried for 177 years, displayed with the reverence it deserved. Graham, we did it. The clock ticked. The pendulum swung. The brass gleamed under lights that had been calibrated to show every detail of the carving that hid everything. Nora appeared beside her, dressed in a new outfit that Margaret had bought for the occasion. Captain was in her pocket, his one button eye peeking out like a reluctant celebrity. Mama, people are lining up outside. Keisha says there are over 1,000. Claire looked at her daughter. 8 years old now. Taller than she'd been a year ago. Steadier. Still carrying a stuffed bear with one eye because some things you didn't outgrow. Some things you carried forever because they had carried you when nothing else would. Are you ready? Nora straightened her shoulders in a gesture that was entirely Edith, entirely genetic, entirely the posture of a Donovan woman preparing to show the world something it hadn't earned the right to see. Captain and I are ready. The doors opened at 10. The crowd that entered moved through the galleries with the hushed reverence of people encountering something that challenged their understanding of what was possible. They stood before the clock and tried to comprehend that this piece of furniture, this thing of wood and brass and glass, had contained a fortune for nearly 2 centuries while the world walked past it without a second glance. They read Seamus Donovan's journal entries and imagined a man carrying an 8-foot clock through the streets of a city that smelled like a new beginning and an ending at the same time. They studied the gems through magnifying displays and saw not wealth but patience, not luxury but endurance. They looked at Nora's drawings in the homelessness gallery and felt something shift in their understanding of what inheritance meant, Because inheritance wasn't just what was given. It was what was received by hands that knew how to hold it. Margaret stood in the gem gallery, watching visitors discover the 31-carat diamond. Their reactions were remarkably similar. The same sharp intake of breath, the same widening of eyes, the same involuntary step backward, as if the stone's beauty exerted a physical force that required distance to survive. Gerald positioned himself near the colonial coin display, ready to answer questions from the scholars and collectors who had traveled across the world to see pieces they'd spent careers reading about. Dr. Holt gave a lecture in the auditorium about the numismatic significance of the collection, her voice carrying the controlled excitement of someone who had waited decades for an audience that could appreciate what she knew. And Donna, the intake worker from the shelter on 4th Street, stood in the homelessness gallery for 45 minutes without moving. When Claire found her there, Donna's eyes were wet. I process hundreds of families a year. I remember your face, Claire. I remember Nora's sneakers. She shook her head slowly. I had no idea. Nobody did. That was the point. At 6 o'clock, as the autumn light turned the windows amber and the first day's crowds began to thin, Patrick Donovan walked through the front door. He was alone. Karen hadn't come. He wore a suit that was slightly too formal for the occasion, the clothing of a man who didn't know how to dress for something he'd never experienced. His face carried the expression of someone entering territory where they weren't sure of the rules. Claire saw him from across the central gallery. For a moment, neither of them moved. The clock ticked between them, counting seconds that felt like years, measuring the distance between siblings who had once caught fireflies together and had somehow ended up on opposite sides of everything. Nora saw him first. She crossed the gallery with the directness of a child who hadn't learned to hesitate. Are you Uncle Patrick? Patrick looked down at the girl he'd never bothered to know. His expression cracked. The professional mask, the defensive posture, the careful control, all of it fractured like ice under sudden weight. Yeah, I'm Uncle Patrick. Nora studied him with Edith's eyes. You look like Graham. She showed me pictures. Patrick's voice was rough. You look like your mom. Mom says you took the house when Graham died. The words were factual, delivered without accusation, but they landed with the force of a verdict. Patrick's face went pale. He looked at Claire, who stood 10 feet away, close enough to intervene, far enough to let this happen. I did. Mom says she forgives you, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing not to carry something heavy anymore. Patrick stared at his niece, the stuffed bear in her pocket, the serious eyes, the posture that was entirely Edith, entirely Claire, entirely the bearing of women who had learned that strength wasn't about force but about endurance. Your mom is smarter than me. Captain says most people are. Patrick laughed. The sound surprised him, surprised Claire, surprised the gallery attendants who had been watching the exchange with careful attention. The laugh was genuine, broken, the sound of something releasing that had been held too long. Can I see the clock? Nora took his hand and led him to the central case. She explained each mechanism with the authority of someone who had been studying them for months, pointing out the circles and vines and flowers that concealed the compartment releases. This one is my favorite. Nora pointed to the southeast corner. It's a flower, but it's really a button. Graham was so smart. She hid everything where nobody would look because nobody looks at flowers closely enough. Patrick pressed his hand against the glass, mirroring Claire's gesture from that morning. His reflection overlapped with the clock's image, the man and the machine sharing the same space for a moment. I wish I'd listened to her stories. Nora nodded. You can listen to mine instead. I know all of them. They stood together for a long time, uncle and niece, while the clock ticked and the gallery emptied and the first day of the Donovan Heritage Museum passed into the kind of memory that changes the color of everything that comes after. Later, after the guests had gone and the staff had begun cleaning and the building had settled into the particular quiet of a space that had held something significant, Patrick found Claire in the office behind the main gallery. He stood in the doorway, not entering, respecting the boundary. I owe you an apology that I don't know how to give. Not for the lawsuit. For everything before it. For not helping when you needed help. For taking what wasn't mine and calling it fair. For being the kind of brother who lets his sister sleep in a car. Claire looked at him. She saw the boy on the swing set. The teenager who had taught her to ride a bike. The man who had become someone she didn't recognize, shaped by greed and entitlement and the particular blindness of people who have never been forced to see themselves clearly. Edith saw this coming, Patrick. All of it. She knew you'd take the house and leave me with nothing. She planned for it. She hid the real inheritance inside the one thing you dismiss as worthless. Patrick's face contorted with something between grief and recognition. She was punishing me. Claire shook her head. She was protecting the collection. But she was also giving you a chance to prove her wrong. You could have helped me. You could have been generous. You could have been the brother she hoped you'd become. You chose not to. That wasn't her punishment. That was your choice. The truth settled between them like sediment in water, clouding everything before slowly clearing to reveal the bottom. Patrick sat in the chair opposite her desk. What happens now? Claire looked at the museum around them, at the galleries filled with a family's history, at the clock ticking in its case, at Nora's drawings on the wall of the homelessness gallery. Now I run this museum. I raise my daughter. I honor Graham's legacy. And if you want to be part of that, you can. But not as an owner. Not as an heir. As family. Patrick's eyes filled. What does that look like? It looks like showing up. Not for the money, not for the attention, not because you want something. Showing up because you care. The way I showed up for Graham every Sunday for 6 years. Patrick was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. I can try. Trying is where everything starts. He left without hugging her. They weren't there yet. Maybe they never would be. But the door was open, and sometimes an open door was more than anyone deserved and exactly what everyone needed. A year passed. Then 2. The Donovan Heritage Museum became one of Louisville's most visited institutions, drawing over 200,000 visitors annually. The collection attracted scholars from 47 countries. The educational programs reached 15,000 students each year, teaching not just gemology and history, but the deeper lessons embedded in the Donovan story, that patience was a form of courage, that protection was a form of love, that the most valuable things in the world were often the ones nobody thought to look at twice. The museum changed Winter Harbor in ways Claire hadn't anticipated. Not Winter Harbor. Louisville. The city began to see itself differently, as a place where extraordinary things could be found if you knew where to look. Tourism increased. Other museums reported higher attendance, as if the Donovan Heritage Museum had reminded people that cultural institutions existed and mattered. Local businesses thrived. The coffee shop across the street from the museum renamed its signature drink the Donovan, a dark roast with honey that Keisha said tasted like courage and stubbornness in equal measure. The bookstore 2 blocks down created a permanent display of books about immigration history, gemology, and family heritage. A jewelry designer in the Highlands began a line inspired by the collection's antique pieces, donating 15% of profits to the Foundation's scholarship fund. But the impact that mattered most to Claire was the one she saw in faces. Not the faces of scholars or collectors or tourists who had traveled across the world to see rare diamonds. The faces of the people who came to the homelessness gallery and stood before Nora's drawings and recognized themselves. A man in a threadbare coat who studied the drawing of 2 figures sleeping in a car and whispered, "That was us last winter." A grandmother with 3 grandchildren who pointed at the shelter bed drawing and told the oldest child, "That's where we stayed when we first came to this city. Remember?" A teenager who stood alone before the clock for 20 minutes, then asked the receptionist if the museum was hiring because she wanted to work in a place that proved things could get better. Claire hired her. Her name was Destiny, and she became the museum's youngest guide, leading tours with the authority of someone who understood the story not from textbooks, but from experience. The foundation funded 24 scholarships for students from families experiencing homelessness. Each scholarship included housing support, because Claire understood that education without stability was a promise without a foundation. She designed the program with Donna from the shelter, ensuring that the application process didn't require the kind of documentation that homeless families often lacked. No proof of address required. No employment verification. Just a conversation and a commitment. The first scholarship recipient was a woman named Angela who had been living in her car with twin daughters for 7 months. She enrolled in the nursing program at the University of Louisville and graduated 2 years later, top of her class. At the graduation ceremony, she found Claire in the audience and said 4 words that made Claire cry for the 5th time since this all began. "You gave us walls." Nora grew. She turned 9, then 10, her personality crystallizing into something that was entirely her own but carried traces of every Donovan woman who had come before. She volunteered at the museum on weekends, leading children's tours with Captain perched on her shoulder, explaining the hidden compartments with the enthusiasm of someone sharing the greatest secret in the world. She told every group the same thing at the end of the tour. My Gram hid treasure inside a clock because she knew that the people who look closest at ordinary things are the ones who find extraordinary things. So look closely at everything. The best stuff is always hidden where nobody thinks to check. Margaret Wu published a definitive catalog of the collection, a 400-page volume that became the standard reference work for 19th-century gemological studies. The 31-carat diamond was officially classified as one of the 50 most significant diamonds in private hands, a designation that brought additional attention and additional responsibility. David Chun transitioned from legal defender to board member, his role shifting from protection to governance. He brought on additional trustees, including Dr. Holt, Keisha Washington, and a community representative from the shelter where Claire and Nora had once slept. Daniel Donovan attended the museum's first anniversary celebration. He came alone, stayed for 2 hours, and spent most of that time in the homelessness gallery, standing before Nora's drawings with an expression that suggested he was finally seeing something he'd spent years refusing to look at. He left a donation at the front desk, modest but sincere, with a note that said simply, "For the scholarships," from someone who should have helped sooner. Patrick came to the museum once a month. Always on Sundays, always alone. He walked through the galleries slowly, reading every placard, studying every artifact, absorbing the story of a family he'd been part of but had never truly known. He brought Nora books about gemology and history, gifts that showed he'd been paying attention to who she was becoming rather than who he wanted her to be. He never asked about the money, never mentioned the lawsuit, never brought Karen, who had filed for divorce 6 months after the museum opened, citing irreconcilable differences, which was the legal term for a marriage that couldn't survive the weight of choices made in the wrong direction. Patrick didn't contest it. He moved into a smaller house closer to the museum and took a job with a nonprofit that helped families facing foreclosure. The pay was modest. The work was hard. He told Claire once, without self-pity, that he was learning what it felt like to be useful rather than important. He also started visiting the farmhouse outside Lexington less frequently. The house that had once been the prize, the reason for the lawsuit, the symbol of everything he'd taken from Claire. He told Claire that walking through its rooms made him feel hollow, because every time he opened a door or sat in a chair, he thought about Edith sitting alone in that kitchen, protecting a secret she couldn't share with her own grandsons because she knew what they'd do with it. That knowledge sat in every room like a guest that would never leave. One Sunday, he found Claire in the central gallery, sitting on the bench before the clock. I understand now why she didn't tell me. Not because she was punishing me, because she knew I wouldn't have understood. Claire looked at her brother, the man who had taken the house and left her with nothing. The man who had filed lawsuits and sent process servers and tried to claim a share of something he'd dismissed as worthless. The man who was now sitting beside her in a museum built from patience and protection and the particular love of women who understood that some things were worth more than money. She didn't have to explain it. Patrick. She showed it. Every Sunday for 30 years, she sat in that kitchen and told stories about this family. Every story was a clue. Every conversation was an invitation. You just weren't listening. Patrick's hands rested on his knees. The hands of a man who had reached for everything and held nothing. I'm listening now. Claire nodded. Then let me tell you about Seamus. About the day he walked off the ship in New York Harbor with a clock on his back and a family's entire future hidden inside it. She told the story, not the way Edith had told it, with the practiced rhythm of someone who had shaped the narrative over decades. Claire told it her own way, with the details she'd learned from the journal and the authentication process and the quiet hours she'd spent sitting with the clock, feeling its weight, understanding its purpose. Patrick listened, really listened, maybe for the first time in his life. And when she finished, he was crying, not the dramatic tears of someone performing grief, but the quiet tears of someone who had finally understood what they'd lost and what they could never get back. Thank you. They sat together in the gallery while the clock ticked. The pendulum swung, the brass gleamed, and for a moment, they were children again, sitting on Edith's porch, listening to stories they didn't yet know were maps to something extraordinary. 3 years after the museum opened, On a crisp November morning that reminded Claire of the day she'd first walked into the storage unit, a woman appeared at the front desk. She was young, mid-20s, wearing a coat that was too thin for the weather and carrying a bag that held everything she owned. A little boy, maybe 4, clung to her hand. His shoes were worn through at the toes. The receptionist looked up. "Welcome to the Donovan Heritage Museum. Admission is free today." The woman hesitated. She looked at the building, at the gleaming displays visible through the glass doors, at the world that existed on the other side of the threshold. "I read about this place. About the woman who found treasure in a clock." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I wanted my son to see it, to know that things can change." The receptionist called Claire. Claire came downstairs. She looked at the woman and saw herself 3 years ago. The same exhaustion, the same fear, the same desperate hope that the world might contain something better than what she'd been given so far. "Welcome." She extended her hand. "I'm Claire." The woman's grip was tentative. "I'm Maria." "And who's this?" The boy pressed closer to his mother's leg. "His name is Tomas." Claire knelt to meet the boy's eyes. "Tomas, do you like treasure?" The boy nodded, cautious but interested. "Come with me. I know where the best treasure is hidden." She led them through the galleries personally, showed Maria the clock, the hidden compartments, the gems that sparkled under calibrated lights. She told the story of Seamus and Thomas and William and Edith. She showed them Nora's drawings in the homelessness gallery. Maria cried in front of the drawing of 2 figures sleeping in a car. Claire handed her a tissue and waited. "I'm living in my car." Maria's voice broke. "I have been for 4 months. Tomas starts school next year, and I don't have an address." Claire felt the weight of recognition, the terrible familiarity of a story she knew from the inside. "We have a scholarship program. It includes housing support. Would you like me to connect you with our coordinator?" Maria's face collapsed into something between disbelief and relief. She nodded, unable to speak. Claire walked Maria and Tomas to Keisha's office, where the young woman who had been the museum's first hire began the process of changing another family's trajectory with the practiced competence of someone who understood that changing the world happened one person at a time. As they walked, Tomas stopped in front of the clock's display case. He pressed his small hands against the glass and looked up at the enormous timepiece with the wonder of a child encountering something that exceeded his understanding of what was possible. "It's really big." Claire's breath caught. The words were Nora's. Different child, different voice, but the same observations spoken with the same reverence. The clock had a way of making children speak in similar languages, as if wonder had its own grammar that transcended individual experience. "It's been keeping secrets for a very long time," Claire said softly. Tomas looked up at her. "My mama has secrets, too. She cries at night when she thinks I'm sleeping." Claire knelt to meet his eyes. "Sometimes mamas cry because they're working very hard to make things better, and sometimes things do get better." Tomas considered this with the gravity of a 4-year-old philosopher. "Will mama's secrets have diamonds in them?" Claire smiled through tears she didn't bother hiding. "Maybe not diamonds, but something just as valuable." Maria turned back, saw Claire kneeling beside her son, and the expression on her face was one Claire recognized with painful precision. The expression of a mother watching a stranger show kindness to her child, knowing she couldn't provide that kindness herself, feeling both grateful and gutted by the fact that gratitude was necessary. "Come on, baby." Claire stood and held out her hand to Tomas, who took it without hesitation, the trust of a child who had decided in that moment that this stranger was safe. She led them to Keisha's office, then stood in the hallway after the door closed, listening to Keisha's warm voice begin explaining the scholarship program, hearing Maria's voice crack and recover and crack again as she realized that the impossible thing she'd stopped believing in was being offered to her by someone who had been exactly where she was and had survived. That evening, Claire stood alone in the central gallery. The museum was closed. The lights were dimmed to their nighttime settings, casting the clock in soft shadow. The pendulum swung. The mechanism ticked. The base held its secrets behind 12 carved mechanisms that only opened for hands that knew where to press. She thought about Edith, about Seamus, about every generation that had added to the clock's hidden chambers and chosen silence over spectacle, protection over profit, patience over indulgence. She thought about Maria and Tomas, about the shelter where she'd once slept, about the auto parts store where she'd sorted spark plugs while a fortune sat in a storage unit 8 miles away. She thought about Nora, now 10 years old, sleeping upstairs in the apartment they'd built into the museum's upper floor because Claire wanted to live where the clock lived, wanted to keep it close the way Edith had kept it close, not out of greed, but out of duty, out of love, out of the understanding that some things required presence. She thought about Patrick, who came every Sunday now and sat in the gallery and listened to Nora tell the stories Edith used to tell. Not because he wanted anything anymore, because he'd finally understood that showing up was the only currency that mattered. She thought about Daniel, who had started volunteering at the shelter on 4th Street, processing intakes with the careful attention of a man trying to make up for years of indifference, one family at a time. And she thought about what the clock had really contained all along. Not diamonds and gold and silver and rare coins worth $287 million. Those were just objects. Beautiful, valuable, historically significant objects, but objects. Nonetheless, what the clock had really contained was trust. Edith's trust in Claire. Seamus's trust in the future. Every generation's trust that the next would understand what they were being given and would protect it with the same fierce, quiet, patient love that had carried it across an ocean and through a century and a half of history. She thought about the word inheritance and how she had misunderstood it for most of her life. She had thought inheritance meant receiving. Now she understood it meant continuing. The gems were not a gift. They were a responsibility passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, each one adding to the weight and choosing to carry it forward instead of setting it down. Each one deciding that protection was worth more than profit, that patience was worth more than pleasure, that the slow accumulation of something meaningful was more valuable than the quick consumption of something easy. Edith had understood this. So had William and Thomas and Seamus. They had lived their lives around the clock, adjusting their choices to accommodate its presence, sacrificing comfort and wealth and the simplicity of ordinary existence to maintain a secret that grew heavier with each passing year. They had done this not because the collection was valuable, but because the act of protecting it was valuable. The discipline it required, the secrecy it demanded, the patience it cultivated. These were the real treasures. The diamonds were just proof that the treasures were real. Claire pressed her hand against the glass and thought about Maria and Tomas downstairs in Keisha's office, beginning a journey that would change their lives. She thought about Angela, the first scholarship recipient, now working as a nurse at a hospital 3 miles from the shelter where she'd once slept. She thought about Destiny, the teenager from the homelessness gallery, now leading tours with the confidence of someone who had found her voice in a place that celebrated stories like hers. The museum had become something larger than Claire had imagined. It was not just a building that held artifacts. It was a living argument that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. That a grandmother in a farmhouse could outmaneuver corporations and siblings and time itself through nothing more than patience and love and the stubborn refusal to let go of something worth keeping. Claire Donovan, who had once slept in a Honda Civic with her daughter and a one-eyed stuffed bear, pressed her hand against the glass case and made a promise to every woman who had stood beside this clock before her. I'll keep it safe. I'll keep it whole. I'll make sure the world knows what you did and why you did it. And when Nora is ready, I'll teach her what you taught me. That the most valuable things in the world aren't the ones people fight over. They're the ones people protect in silence, in patience, in the hidden chambers of grandfather clocks that everyone else throws away. The clock ticked on. Steady, patient, alive, keeping time the way it always had. One generation at a time. Nora's voice drifted down from upstairs, talking to Captain about tomorrow's tour group and the new batch of students coming from a school on the west side. Her voice carried the particular confidence of someone who had found her place in a story that stretched back further than memory and forward further than imagination. And Claire smiled, because Edith had been right all along. The clock did know things. It knew that time was patient. It knew that secrets kept by love lasted longer than secrets kept by fear. It knew that the tick of a pendulum was the heartbeat of a family that refused to be forgotten. And it knew that some clocks don't just tell time. They tell the truth. And in the morning, when the museum opened its doors again, when the first visitors of the day crossed the threshold and stepped into the light of the central gallery, when children pressed their faces against the glass and gasped at the carved mahogany and the gleaming brass, they would hear it. The tick of a clock that had been carried across an ocean on a starving man's back. The tick of a clock that had survived a famine and a depression and 2 world wars. The tick of a clock that had been dismissed as worthless by 2 brothers who couldn't see past the cracked face and the frozen pendulum to the fortune hidden in the base. The tick of a clock that had waited, patient and silent and full of trust, for a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything still left to find. The tick of a grandmother's love, measured in seconds, counted in diamonds, kept forever. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.